Welcome to session 2 of the EDQW training. First, I'm going to talk about the mission statement of the EDQW, and it is to develop and recommend strategies related to sampling, testing, and quality assurance for environmental programs to eliminate redundancy, streamline programs, improve data quality, and promote data integrity. Coordinate the exchange of information among DoD components, develop DoD insurances to implement environmental quality systems and promote cost-effective government oversight, and implement and provide oversight of the DoD eLab. So in our EMDQ webinar series, last Wednesday, we had session 1, Emerging Issues and Data Management. And this recording will be published on the EDQW page of DENX shortly. And of course, we're in session 2 today, our EDQW training. And then session 3 will be held on June 30th, which is the per and polyfluoroalkyl substance as a topic. All webinars being planned for the future, or I guess all meetings being planned for the future will be webinars, and potential topics will include the release of QSM updates, data validation concerns, but if you have any additional topics that you would like us to cover, feel free to submit those via the EDQW help desk. Okay, it looks like we still have a few people joining. Zach, do you think a majority of the people have entered this training from the old link?
Hey, yeah, I think you're safe to go ahead and get started. And
Okay.
then anybody else I'll send this way.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you. So cameras and microphones for all attendees have been disabled. Submit any content-related questions or responses via the chat function. And so for my specific presentation, this being the first session, you will just enter your responses into the chat. And we'll also be tracking any questions, so we'll make sure not to lose anything. Is there a way to disable those old? Oh, okay. And then send any technical issues related to Adam, Emma, or Zachary. And as stated, these webinars are being recorded and we'll upload them to the DENX EDQW homepage. Okay, so now moving into our training session. This one is data review and implementation training. It will be split up into 2 separate phases. Phase 1 is the planning phase, and that'll be presented by myself, Nancy Cooper. I'm a chemist at the Army Corps of Engineers Environmental and Munitions Center of Expertise. We have Dr. Richard Bernhardt, who is a toxicologist risk assessor at the EMCX, and Dr. Denise Rivers, who is also a chemist at the EMCX. And then we have phase 2, which is the implementation phase, which will be presented by myself again and Grace Nepomuceno, or Dr. Grace Nepomuceno, and she's a chemist at AFCAC Civil Engineering Center. One disclaimer I would like to make for these training topics is that these slides were developed on the point of view of my experience at AFCAC and now at USACE, and so some agencies might do things a little bit differently. And then also I wanted to point out that the names I have underlined are our EDQW members. Okay, so let's get into phase 1 planning. It seems like we have a pretty solid number, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Okay. Phase 1 of this training is to focus on setting a strong foundation. Our goals include selecting appropriate laboratories, differentiating between definitive and screening data, understanding key considerations when planning for PFAS investigations, project-specific sampling and analytical requirements, and promoting positive and productive communication. While many of these principles apply to all environmental investigations, we'll highlight additional PFAS considerations throughout phase 1 and phase 2 of this training. So with those goals in mind, let's start by looking at one of the most critical early decisions a project chemist should make: the requirements of selecting the proper laboratory. So let's talk about the specific requirement that guides our decision of selecting an appropriate laboratory, which starts with the DoD Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, ELAP. The DoD ELAB is a unified DoD program, which includes the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. And we use accreditation bodies that will um, through which commercial laboratories can voluntarily demonstrate competency and document conformance to both a DoD standard and an international standard for environmental sampling and testing. These standards I'll talk about a little bit further later on in the presentation. The DoD ELAP is described in Part 181 of Title 32 Code of Federal Regulations and the DoD Manual, and this was cited from the DoD instruction. This isn't just a check in the box. This program is here to help ensure quality, defensibility, and consistency across our projects. So now that we've identified where this requirement is in the Code of Federal Regulations, let's take a look at the policy itself. This is cited from the Code of Federal Regulations, and it states that it is DoD policy in accordance with the DoDI to implement the DoD ELAB for collection of definitive data in support of DERP at all DoD operations, activities, and installations, including government-owned, contractor-operated facilities, and formerly used defense sites. And so with a clear understanding of the policy itself, the next logical question is, what is definitive data? And if data isn't definitive, then what is it? So I have a few definitions for definitive and screening data and their appropriate citation. So cited from the DoDI, it states that definitive data is analytical data of known quality, concentration, and level of uncertainty. The level of quality and uncertainty of analytical data are consistent with the requirements for the decision to be made, so it needs to be suitable for decision making. Data used for a risk assessment or site closure is considered definitive data. And then I have two definitions for screening data. One is more general, taken from the DoD ELAB fact sheet, which states that data are of sufficient quality to support an intermediate or preliminary decision, but must eventually be supported by definitive data. So screening data cannot be used to prove that a site is clean. The second definition comes from the ASD memo, which states for PFAS specifically, determine presence or magnitude of PFAS concentration, but not to confirm absence. The EDQW strongly encourages using a DoD ELAP accredited laboratory for screening data. This is to help ensure a minimum level of quality assurance and quality control. And depending on your specific agency, screening data might require additional approvals, of course, through the appropriate channels. So now that we understand definitive and screening data and what they are and their importance for approval of use, it's important to understand how the laboratories are producing data of known quality, and that's where the EDQW comes in again. The EDQW manages the DoD ELAP program and establishes the DoD standard mentioned a few slides ago. So let's look at those standards again in a little bit more detail. So remember that the DoD and international standards are used to demonstrate competency and document conformance. The international standard is the International Organization for Standardization and International Electrotechnical Commission. This is commonly referred to as ISO IEC 17025. And then afterwards is the year of publication, and it's updated. The DoD standard is the DoD DOE Quality Systems Manual for Environmental Laboratories, commonly referred to as the DoD DOE QSM. The latest version of the DoD DOE QSM version 6.0 incorporates requirements from ISO IEC 17025 5, year 2017. And so I've spent a lot of time working on the QSM 6.0 specifically, and I actually really loved it. And I really believe in the value that it can bring. I've included these beginning reference slides so our whole community can better understand where these requirements are coming from, what they mandate, how the EDQW fits into the big picture. And throughout the training, you'll see this as the overall theme. So with that foundation set, let's shift gears a little bit. And for the rest of the training, we're going to talk about the role of the project chemist. And when I'm talking about a project chemist throughout all of my presentation, I'm referring to the government chemist as well as a contractor chemist because we have to work together. Okay, so what exactly should a project chemist review? Ideally, I would say the entire QAP because chemists can rule the world. But we know in practice, time and resources may be limited, so I've included the worksheets to prioritize more directly impact quality and defensibility. And I'll of course add the caveat that each agency might slightly differ. And so throughout my presentation, you'll see these little chat boxes that have like QAP worksheet numbers specified. And I've included those just as a really easy reference, visual reference if you ever want to come back to this presentation. Um, Additionally, the project chemist should review the laboratory procedures. And yes, our accreditation bodies will review the procedures, but their review does not consider project-specific factors. Additionally, the field sampling procedures, because good data starts at collection, as well as the data validation procedures. So next we'll talk about a few QAP worksheets and PFAS-specific considerations. Okay, so the first worksheet we'll talk about is QAP worksheet 15, which is required for each analyte, method, and matrix combination. So this requirement is taken from the optimized UFP QAP worksheets. And in a few slides, we'll have the luxury to hear about a risk assessor's perspective on how they handle a project action limit less than the limit of quantitation. Um, and I would like to add that each agency might differ, so it's critical to stay on top of different policies. Before that, I did want to take a few minutes to talk about terminology differences between a risk assessor and the chemist, because this is an area where I've personally struggled when communicating with my risk assessors. So some of the terms that we both like to use are project action limit and project action level, and they sound like they could be used interchangeably, but depending on which side of the table are on can mean two different things. The chemist version of a project action limit is what a risk assessor would describe as the project screening level. And getting from the initial screening level to a final action level involves establishing a clear basis for action, which we know should be scientifically defensible and site specific. So to visualize this process, I've created a really cute metaphor. So imagine that you have an egg. You think there's something in that egg, but you're not sure what it will become. Maybe it's empty, maybe it'll become a terrorizing chick, or maybe it'll be a cute baby dinosaur. So with that understanding, so with that uncertainty is what we're dealing with when we're looking at the screening level. The risk assessor would say that the project screening level is used to identify contamination that may require further investigation, a formal risk assessment, or potentially an action. In a risk assessment, they can help determine which chemicals are carried forward for detailed evaluation. Now we know we don't have an empty egg, we actually got a cute baby dinosaur. We have established the basis for action. So once we have established that basis for action, um, or once unacceptable risk is identified, then that's when the project will essentially take action, which could be a removal action, remedial action, or implement land use controls, and at which point you'll identify action levels, which could be the maximum contamination levels or state applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements, ARRs. And so, from my experience, I don't believe that this is just confusion between the chemist and the risk assessor. I've seen this same confusion pop up during project discussions when writing QAP Worksheet 11, specifically DQO6, and trying to draft clear, logical decision rules that will guide how the project interprets the data and the potential to act or take action. So I just wanted to make sure everyone was prepared when the project screening level terminology is used when our risk assessor is presenting. And so just another visualization tool for future reference, I've included the project action limit and the project screening level on worksheet 15. So now let's think about when LOQs are too high and the options that we typically consider. We might consider alternative methods. Like we could consult our laboratory for better analytical methods. We might think about method modification, like a larger sample volume. We could concentrate the extract, alternative wavelengths, perform the analysis in selective ion monitoring mode. We could consider using a different laboratory or using the background threshold value, which we know represents the concentration of a chemical that exists naturally in the environment before any site-related activities occur. And this can help us determine if the detection levels are due to the site or natural. But let's say in the case of PFAS that that none of these are an option, and that all we have to consider is to elevate the project screening level. So now I'm going to let Rick take control of the slide. So I'm going to stop sharing. And while he gets set up, um, we're going to hear from him and get a better understanding of their perspective on the usability of the data, especially when we're dealing with the elevated LOQs. And I'm thankful that Rick has agreed to present at the EDQW. He has been very passionate about this topic and has a clear commitment to education. And with that, I'll let Rick take it away.
Hi, everybody. I appreciate the chance to talk on this. Well, I think Nancy just hit the nail on the head when we talk about project screening levels and project action levels. I think actually it's funny. I think between the chemist and the risk assessors, we sort of draw lines sometimes, and we both have strong opinions why one thing should be called one or another. But I will talk about project screening levels on this one. Because risk assessors, we have two macro levels of risk assessments. The first is the screening level risk assessment, and then that the second is the baseline risk assessment. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with eco or human health; those two macro level risk assessments apply. And really, that even the screening level risk assessment, it can become as complicated as you want to make it. But fundamentally, you are taking a screening level and you are comparing that to your on-site concentrations. And if it exceeds, you move forward into possibly doing some sort of action, like a remedial action. It's a little different with certain chemicals like lead. Lead has what we would call an action level. And when you exceed that, for residential now, that's going to be 200 parts per million. When you exceed that number, there's no need for a more detailed risk assessment because you've crossed that threshold. You've crossed the action level, and you need to remediate unless there are certain extenuating circumstances. So anyways, that's why I'll talk about screening levels. In the few minutes that we had before this presentation began, I actually went to EPA's RSL website and I verified that the most recent RSL is still the November 2024 RSL. Usually there would be one published for May, but rumor has it that there won't be a May RSL, that the next publication may be in November of 2025. And it mainly comes down to this issue, the PFAS issue. So I guess the question here is why are we so focused on PSLs for PFAS? And the short answer is that there are some regulatory thresholds that we can't measure using the best available technology. So in this case, you can see PFAS, that pooled MDL is higher than the regional screening level. If you can't measure it, what do you do? It's the same kind of thing with PFOA. The pooled MDL is higher than the screening level. And there are also instances where that applies for soil as well. It's not just drinking water. So you can't really give a one-size-fits-all answer to how do you handle this, because there are different goals depending on whether you're in the SI. In the SI, you want to know, is there contamination for an anthropogenic compound, like series of compounds like PFAS? If you have detections there on site, you know that came from, a human release. There's no question there. So in the SI, you're mainly gathering information to say, should we continue into the RI? Now that's different than when you're in the RI, because in the RI, you want to understand the nature and extent of your contamination. You want to know, what are those maximum concentrations? Ideally, you would calculate your 95 UCLs. You would want to know what the boundaries are. You would want to know which media are impacted and which receptors could be affected by those media. But I want to break this down just a little bit more and plant that seed that you can't even treat all of the RI the same. If I give you one answer on how do we deal with elevated reporting levels in the RI, it's going to come up short, because in that, if we think about the RIs like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and we say that each phase represents a year or multiple years worth of investigation and interpretation, we're going to have a different conceptual site model. That conceptual site model is going to be updated every time we complete a phase for the RI. If we're not learning something new in each investigation, why are we doing the investigation? So as the CSM changes, our goals should change, and the way we react to our understanding of site conditions should change. So in that SI and in that RI phase 1, we're willing to accept more uncertainty. We're willing to accept more generalizations in the SI and RI phase 1, more default assumptions. But as we get to phase 3, phase 4 of the RI, if we get that far, we really want to be filling all those data gaps and having enough data that we can move forward and start to make decisions in the risk assessment. So I'm going to talk about 3 options here, and I am assuming that the 4 recommendations from the 2005 EDQW UFP QAP have been evaluated. If you have elevated reporting levels that are above your screening levels, I'm assuming we've already considered using a different lab, and that's not going to solve our problem. I'm assuming we've already considered using a different analytical method. We have to use 1633 for PFAS at the very least. So I'm assuming that's already been considered. The other 2 options are to accept a higher level of uncertainty or raise the screening level. If we've already considered those and we're considering raising the screening level, that's where I'm starting here. Now we can either raise that screening level right up front. We can adjust that in the UFP QAP. We can leave that screen level as it is, and we can move forward right through to the risk assessment. And I'm going to talk about these options again. Or we could advocate for some sort of intervention. Maybe it's headquarters, but maybe it's some sort of policy support. Because right now we don't really have a definitive policy for how to handle PFAS in the RI. OSD put out a memo in January that talks about how to handle PFAS in the SI, but there have been multiple proposals made and forwarded to OSD, and I'll just say that if there was an easy solution, it would have been chosen by now. So I'm going to get into those three options. Raising that PSL up front. If we're going to raise that PSL, it's going to affect obviously which COPCs we carry forward, and that's going to affect which media we have to look at. Soil, surface soil, subsurface soil, surface water, etc. And then based on which media are impacted above levels of concern, that's going to affect which receptors we're going to evaluate. Those receptors, I mean, they have their individual screening levels. So if we have, for example, avian insectivores or avian carnivores or mammals or, you know, what have you, each of those have different screening levels. And of course, humans have different screening levels. So if we have ecological concerns and we have human health concerns, we're going to choose the most stringent of all of those possible screening levels. If we don't have eco concerns, then we're only going to consider the human health. But the human health screening levels aren't all the same either. There are residential screening levels, there are industrial screening levels, there are recreational screening levels, and you can develop site-specific screening levels. So really, that PSL selection and the receptors that you have, that's going to be the primary driver for what screening levels you choose. So you can't just raise the PSL because it's not convenient. You know, that it is determined by certain fixed factors like your receptors. Okay, so if we don't have, for example, residential screening levels, there's no sense in screening against residential screening levels when your CSM starts to take shape. And that's where I'm coming back to that notion that there's a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 RI. Initially in the SI and probably in the RI phase 1, we're going to default to residential screening levels, even though there may not be residential receptors there. Because again, what we're concerned about in the SI in particular is whether there was a spill. And those residential screening levels are usually most stringent. So we'll select those. But there is a methodical process to make that happen, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But really, if we're concerned about, if chemists are concerned about what level of precision and what level of accuracy we need, you know, out of the analytical instruments and out of the methods, and whether or not the PSLs are, whether or not the reporting levels are sufficient based on the PSLs, I'm going to show you some information that talks about the level of precision that we need and the level of variability that's inherent in these screening levels. And the take-home message is, just because we exceed a screening level doesn't mean that organisms are going to die, that organisms are going to be affected in any way. And you'll understand that better once I walk through this next slide. So when we're developing a project screening level, part of the risk assessment involves the toxicity analysis. And so toxicologists will do generally laboratory studies, and they'll have a very controlled experiment that has, you know, a control group, and it'll have different treatment groups at different concentrations. So you might have, let's just say, one concentration at 1 part per million, another treatment group of your fish or your mice or whatever your study organism is at 50 parts per million, and another concentration, maybe 100 parts per million, and, you know, whatever those concentrations are. But the organism is either raised in that concentration of water, for example, or they're fed a certain concentration daily. and it's very controlled, and they're going to get, let's say 3 doses per day, and you're going to have those rigid studies, and you're going to come out. Ideally, you would have this double-blind experiment, and you're going to come out of that with what we call a no observed adverse effect level, the NOAEL, or the lowest observed adverse effect level, the LOAEL. The NOAEL is the highest concentration that you don't have an adverse effect. The LOAEL is the lowest concentration that you do have an adverse effect. So this whole process starts with identifying the NOAEL and the LOAEL. And let's just say your NOAEL becomes 100 parts per million. Ideally, you would start with the NOAEL, but if you need to, there are ways to start with the LOAEL. But we're in our example, we're going to start with 100 parts per million LOAEL. Right away, we're going to divide that concentration by 10, just to transition from animal studies to human studies. And so in this case, our levels of concern is going to go from 100 parts per million. Again, this is the concentration that didn't have an adverse effect. And we're going to go right down to 10 ppm, an order of magnitude. Next, we're going to divide by another 10, because not all humans are the same, and some subpopulations like children or people with different health conditions may be affected differently. So we're going to divide that by 10 as well. So we've already gone 2 orders of magnitude to get to make progress towards developing a screening level. If those original studies were based on subchronic studies, not chronic studies, we're going to divide by 10 again. In this case, in my example, we're going to pretend that that didn't affect our toxicity reference value. If, as I said, if you start with the LOAEL, you go through this process. If you start with the LOAEL, you would divide by 10. In my example, I'm pretending that we started with the NOAEL, so no change to the toxicity reference value. And then, if you don't have a lot of confidence in those studies, and there's a methodical process to evaluate confidence, you would divide by another, 1 to 10, just for the subjective value. In this case, I am going to pretend that we divide by 10. So we started with 100 parts per million, and just by this methodical process, now all of a sudden, we could be screening with 0.1. But that's not the end of it. We also do this exposure assessment, and that is 1,000 times more complicated than this methodical process I just talked about. And so that's where we work our magic, and we're going to cut. That's where we're actually going to develop the screening level. And in that magic that I just glossed over, there are certain fixed assumptions, like a resident is exposed for 350 days per year, 24 hours per day, for 26 years. Now, if anybody online has ever known anybody who stayed in their home on their property for 24 hours per day, 350 days per year for 26 years, I'd like to meet you. I've never met anybody like that. But these are the default assumptions that are universally agreed upon. So what I'm doing is I'm showing that there's all this sort of uncertainty and imprecision when you're developing a screening level. And so we've gone from this concentration where your organism shows no adverse effect at 100 parts per million, and that can produce a screening level of 2.3 parts per million. So I'm getting back to that idea that when you have screening levels that you can't even measure, how important is it? How important is it that you can't measure that concentration? Yes, we've agreed that there's this methodical process. And yes, we've agreed that there are certain default assumptions. But are those realistic? If you exceed that screening level, it doesn't mean that you're going to have an adverse effect at all. Typically, those uncertainty factors, they're going to be between a few hundred and a few thousand. But it all starts with a reliable NOAEL or LOAEL. With PFAS, we do not have reliable NOAELs or LOAELs. And that gets down to the peer-reviewed original publications that came out that are based on epidemiological studies, not based on these double blinds. And I could go into this for days, but basically there are a lot of confounding factors that really, if you're being generous, you would say they bring into question the original numbers. And those are creating these screen levels that are just minute. So how important is that analytical precision that you guys are concerned about, through your GC mass spec or whatever methods you guys are using? Like we can talk about how the accuracy and precision of the values you generate have less confidence when you're closer to the DL or the LOD or the LOQ. But really, we're dealing with these micro scale numbers. And what I've just shown you is a realistic example where your screening level is orders of magnitude less than concentrations that don't cause any adverse effect. It's important what you do, and it's important that we're able to have those detailed conversations with the regulators, with the regulator chemists, or else we're going to get walked all over. Super important. But I just want to give that notion that just because you're exceeding a screening level doesn't mean you're going to wreak havoc in the environment. So how important are those PSL exceedances? You could tell me. What are the consequences of raising the PSLs? Well, you're going to have debate in your RI phase 1. You're going to have debate with the regulators in phase 2 and phase 3. You're going to have that debate, and you're going to draw lines, and you're going to take, positions, and it could, and often does, cause this adversarial relationship between us and the regulators that is carried through the project. And so sometimes it's best just to carry that forward into the risk assessment. We know we would have certain exceedances, and we would carry those exceedances right through to the risk assessment and talk about those in the uncertainty section. If you can agree with the regulators to raise that screen level, great. It shows that we both have this great understanding, but that's kind of hard to come by sometimes. So we have to talk about these types of issues when you have elevated reporting levels and you have non-detects. We have to talk about that in the uncertainty section, and we use this multiple lines of evidence approach where we're bringing in other analysis, like what was the facility used for? Is there probable cause to suspect this group of chemicals was even used at the facility? Did we detect this group of chemicals in any other media? There's a lot of lines of evidence that we could bring in to say, all right, it is likely that even though we don't have sufficient reporting levels, that the chemical was used on site and may have been spilled. Or we can use this multiple lines of evidence and say it's not likely to have been used on site. How often did we have elevated reporting levels? Sometimes, of course, there can be sample issues that affect the reporting levels. So if it's a small percentage at the time, we don't get stuck on that. And of course, we would never decide to remediate based on concentrations that we can't even measure. So, again, we're going to talk about that in the uncertainty section. We're going to say that, yes, they were elevated, but there were no detects, and, we're done. And until technology improves, there's no more we can do because we couldn't even measure, the compound on site. And so we wouldn't be able to measure whether any remediation is successful. Yeah, and then this is just like any site anywhere on the planet, if information becomes available in the future to suggest there's a release, we would open a new investigation. So if we don't raise that screening level right up front, we're continually reporting in all of our products that are out there for the public that we can't measure it. That is the truth, but it also sets up this perspective that, you know, maybe the investigation's sloppy or something. So that's kind of a downside that people talk about. But carrying that forward, carrying those insufficient reporting levels forward, that is the standard practice, and discussing that in the risk assessment in the uncertainty section. That's the standard. And then, you know, the last option is to advocate for guidance, and we can also think of strengths and weaknesses for that. And of course, just saying I need help, that's not nearly as good as, you know, drafting a proposal. So when to engage the risk assessment? Well, really, anytime you want to make sure that that data is going to be usable. The risk assessor doesn't have all the answers, of course, but, you know, we're not in some ivory tower. You know, of course, we're interactive and want to be engaged in the product. So really, conversations are good things. We really want to know if we're going to expect certain compounds to have elevated reporting levels. We know that, you know, PFAS is going to have some problems. We know that some of our naphthalines are going to have some problems. But, you know, anytime you become aware that a project is going to suffer from this issue, we'd appreciate the heads up. Yeah, and anytime you're going to screen, you know, initially screen for those BSLs. Again, just some knowledge that this particular project, you know, is facing some of these issues. It's good to know about that. Oh, looks like my animation's out of line. When you're near the end of the SI, that's the point you're going to decide whether we're going to move forward into the RI or not. So if you don't have sufficient reporting levels at that point, we really want to know that, because that can really cause a lot of controversy when we're deciding to either shut down the case at the end of the RI, I'm sorry, at the end of the SI, or move forward into the RI. Yeah, and then if you're struggling to make those decisions in worksheet 11, you know, give us a shout. Maybe we can help. And again, the answer is going to differ if you're at RI phase 1 versus RI phase 3 or 4. And if you have, you know, if we have elevated reporting levels that are based on high moisture, you know, if it's correctable, well, you know, we're not going to take the same action. We're going to go out and we're going to, you know, we're going to want resampling. And if you're at the end of the RI, right before, if you have one more chance to sample before that risk assessment, you know, we'd like to know that. That's really, that's the meat of what I wanted to share today. I don't know if we're doing questions and comments now, or should we wait to the end, Nancy?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Gotcha.
Yeah, so thanks, Rick, for that walkthrough. I think what we'll do is, since you do have approved leave, we'll let you get back to your vacation. And if there's any questions for a risk assessor topic, then we'll make sure to capture it and coordinate with you appropriately.
That sounds great.
Okay.
Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rick. That was really beneficial, hopefully to everyone, not just me. Okay. So I just want to just come back to, full circle, come back to the chemists. And so with project-specific considerations on handling the elevated LOQs and the associated uncertainty, I just want the project chemist to know it's not just about understanding how we're going to interpret the data, but how we have to document our decisions early, clearly, and defensively. And so if the LOQ is greater than our project screening level, then that QAP should include discussion, acknowledging the LOQ exceedances and the exceeds the project screening level, and outline the project team's decision and rationale for how to proceed. And so with that foundation set, we're going to shift gears again to look at PFAS-specific requirements that project chemists should be aware of during the planning phase. And so I'm going to turn the mic over to Denise, and I'm excited for Denise to present because she brings not only a depth of experience with the method itself, but also extensive experience reviewing and developing QAPs across a range of PFAS projects. So Denise, do you want to do a mic check?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Denise Rivers from the USACE EMCX. So let's talk all things total suspended solids, meaning why was the threshold developed in method 1633 and why is it necessary? No matter how many precautions your team takes, how long you attempt to stabilize a well, how carefully you redevelop that well, total suspended solids happens. If you are collecting any sort of aqueous sample for 1633 or 1633A, the potential for a TSS content greater than 50 milligrams is there, and that suspended solids may clog your SPE cartridges. And this is for any method that uses SPE for cleanup. 1633 is not unique in this cleanup process. The trick is to plan for that total suspended solids content during the QAP writing phase, rather than once you have a wicked high turbidity in the field. Next slide, please. All right, good TSS and identification and management starts in the field, and therefore starts with protocols and communication pathways stated in the project UFP QAP. As stated, method 1633A recommends a limit of less than 50 milligrams of suspended solids. Now, little housekeeping here. For the purpose of the rest of this discussion, the project team that I am referring to consists of the government and the contractor working in unison, and should include a minimum of the project managers, the chemists, and the risk assessors on both sides. So first, while writing the QAP, the project team is responsible for determining an acceptable TSS threshold to meet the project DQOs. And this could be the 50 milligram limit stated in method 1633, or it could be lower. That is completely up to the team. Next, the contractor chemist should talk with the contracted lab or labs regarding options within their SOPs. Once the options are identified, then it's time to call a meeting with the project team and decide on a path. At minimum, that meeting should include the contractor risk assessor, project manager and chemist, the government equivalents, and maybe even your regulator, like Rick was saying. The team as a whole needs to decide what sample preparation option they will implement, verify that option meets the DQOs, and determine a field benchmark for turbidity that will set off a communication pathway from the field all the way up to the lab. Now, why turbidity? It is a reasonable proxy in the field to launch the communication pathway, but I'll discuss that more on the next slide. Once agreed on, back one, Nancy. Once agreed upon, all of these sample preparation decisions and communication pathways must be documented within the UFP QAP. At a minimum, that includes worksheets 6 and 12, but it is recommended to also include information in worksheet 11, specifically DQO 6. So now we can go to the next slide. There we go. Awesome. As mentioned, good data starts in the field, and the management of total suspended solids in aqueous PFAS samples is no different. Turbidity does not necessarily equate to total suspended solids. I'll acknowledge that full well, because some suspended solids can be translucent. This is why that additional sample aliquot for a true total suspended solids analysis is important. However, turbidity can serve as a reasonable surrogate to identify, again, in the field, when an aqueous sample can cause trouble for the lab, followed by your data validator and the project team during the data usability assessment. The project team should agree on a turbidity benchmark. So for here, I suggested 108 NTU. So why did I choose 100 NTU? Well, if you take the 50 milligram limit in method 1633, which is for a 500 milliliter sample, ramp that volume up to a full liter, that gives you 100 milligrams per liter, which can roughly equate to 100 NTU. Voila. meeting or exceeding that agreed on turbidity benchmark, which again, here the example is 100 NTU. I've seen them as low as 25 NTUs. It's up to the project team. Once that benchmark is met or exceeded, that would launch a series of communications and actions by the project team, the contract laboratory, and the data validation team. The field procedures documented in the QAP should address how the field team will attempt to reduce that turbidity below the benchmark, as well as recording those turbidity measurements on the field paperwork and the chains of custody. Now, does the field crew need to include the turbidity measurements for every single sample on the chains? Absolutely not. No way. Only those turbidity values that exceed the project team determined threshold should be placed on the chain, since this would serve as a flashing red light for the lab that, hey, we got a problem here. So in addition to that written record, verbal communication procedures should also be established and documented. Those steps and timeframes should include notifications from the field team lead to the project chemist, from the contractor chemist to the laboratory PM, and from the contractor chemist to the data validator and the DUA team. Next slide, please. Excellent. So let's recap why proactive measures regarding total suspended solids matter. First, taking proactive steps during the QAP writing phase will avoid post-project surprises. If the project team waits until the lab is calling about SPE issues, or the team finds out during stage 4 of data validation that only a portion of the 500 milliliter sample was able to pass through the SPE, both of these scenarios have happened in recent projects that we've seen. Basically, waiting until after the fact to address these types of issues can cause frustration and delays for all involved parties. So the project team needs to work in collaboration with their laboratories before the project begins to understand their capabilities, the lab's capabilities, and ensure that those capabilities are aligned with the project-specific needs and thresholds. The key takeaway is that by establishing clear expectations and directions early with the field crew, laboratories, and data validators, we can avoid confusion and ensure everyone follows correct procedures from the start, which then translates into work that aligns and meets project goals. And this takeaway can be applied to any project, not just a PFAS project. Next slide, please. Excellent. So let's discuss the option, or what options are provided by EPA Method 1633 when it comes to a high total suspended solids content. Per section 9.1.2 of the method, modification is permitted to only improve separations or lower measurement costs. For instance, sample volumes are a project-specific decision. A project team may find that due to the complexity of a matrix or difficulty by which a sample is collected, and I am specifically looking at you lysimeters, only a smaller volume can be collected on this project. Okay. Well, the method stated volume of 500 milliliters is not required to obtain a representative sample of field conditions. The volume is ultimately the project team's decision and is not determined by the laboratory's bottleware. In other words, the laboratory may send 125 milliliter containers in the bottle order, but the team may want to actually stick with that 500 milliliter method specified amount. Again, that's the project team's decision. However, per the new EDQW memo on EPA Method 1633, sample volume modifications, a minimum of 100 milliliters of aqueous field sample must be collected, and Method 1633B, when it comes out, will also state this volume as the minimum limit for collection. However, also per the EDQW memo, an exception to this minimum volume is allowed only when historical data indicates the sampling source contains high PFAS concentrations. Sorry. Next slide, please. Okay, now, as mentioned in the first bullet, the method also provides flexibility regarding the sample cleanup processes. For instance, visual inspection in lieu of the TSS analysis is permitted according to section 11.1.1.6 of method 1633A. However, because TSS can be translucent, as I mentioned, and clog an SBE cartridge, the project team is still encouraged to collect enough sample for a proper TSS analysis. Multiple SBE cartridges are allowed, but they can also become costly for the lab and increase data turnaround time and increase uncertainty associated with the data. Centrifugation is an option that would need to be discussed among the project team and should include discussion topics such as when to add the EIS and analyzing the solid pellet separately. I'll discuss this a little bit more on the next slide. So with regards to subsampling, per section 8.2.1 of method 1633A, all submitted aqueous samples must be prepared and analyzed in their entirety, and subsampling is avoided whenever possible. This is because PFAS analytes are known to bind to the interior surface of the sample container. One of the only exceptions is, as I mentioned, for issues like high concentrations of PFAS when pre-screening determines they are too high for the whole sample to be prepared. Next slide, please. And so let's look at the centrifugation a little bit more in depth. Centrifugation must be agreed on by the project team and must address more than just that centrifugation step. The project team, in conjunction with the lab or labs, must also discuss and agree on when the EIS is added within the preparation, to what phase the original container rinse is added, and decide if the solid pellet is analyzed separately. If the project team is considering through their DQOs that separate analyses of the aqueous and solid phases may be warranted, the team should keep in mind that laboratories may charge per phase. I mean, they're essentially preparing and analyzing two separate samples. The nominal weight for a solid sample is 5 grams, and less than that weight could increase the sensitivity limits for the PFAS analytes. The team should also have a discussion with the risk assessors to determine how that data from the separate phases will be used and reported. And all of this information will need to be included within worksheet 11, your DQO step 6 specifically, and worksheets 12 and 28 must be included for a solid matrix analysis if you aren't already analyzing a solid matrix within the project. Now I'll turn the slides back to Nancy, and who will finish up the section of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. And did I come off mute properly?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to continue to focus on PFAS-specific requirements, but I'm going to shift towards how those considerations should be documented in QAP Worksheet 19 and 30. This worksheet review is critical to ensure proper sampling techniques are documented. Again, this table requirement was taken from the Optimized UFP QAP worksheets and should include the analyte and matrix, the method and the method accreditation date, as well as the data package turnaround time, which we know are project specific. The table should also include the container requirements, preservation, preparation hold time, and analytical hold time. These 4 entries require the project chemist to be familiar with the method-specific requirements, but it's also important to stay up with the EDQW homepage, because that's where we post memos and resources that can be used to help our project chemists develop and review the QAPs. For example, we have an EDQW memo on 1633A sample volume modifications that Denise mentioned earlier, and that should be considered during the development of the container entry. And the recommendation to address hold times in the EDQW memo should be considered for the preparation and analytical hold time requirements. And so to show the importance of this worksheet, I wanted to show some examples provided by Dr. Sarah Choike. She is a chemist at Eurofins Denver, and to show where requirements were not met, and later we'll highlight the issues that these can cause. Okay, so let's start with an aqueous sample, since I said our worksheet 19 and 30 reference groundwater samples. The first requirement is the sample shall be aqueous and not a solvent. As Denise highlighted earlier, the method recommends total suspended solids less than 50 milligrams per liter, but again, project-specific consideration. The sample should not foam and it shouldn't be multiphasic, and ideally it should be homogeneous. So now looking at some of these figures provided by Dr. Choiki, you'll see several real-world examples where the laboratory did not receive samples that follow the method-specific requirements, and this often comes back as gaps in communication or oversight during the planning phase. And so another key requirement that I want to point out is not to fill the aqueous bottles past the shoulder. And on the slide here, you'll see those bottom 5 samples were clearly overfilled past the shoulder line, and this is a direct violation of the method. It can introduce headspace issues, compromise extractions, and can cause bottle leakage. And so in the next phase, I'm going to provide an example of why the volume is so important. So let's look at some more solid samples, again provided by Dr. Choiki. Oops. Okay, great. The requirement for solid samples is that the percent moisture should be less than 80%, and these samples should be homogeneous, and the method requires a particle reduction of 1 millimeter. There should not be any organic material, we should not see any large rocks in the sample, and the field team should remove any rocks, invertebrates, or foreign objects. There's also a requirement not to fill the jar more than 3/4 full, which we can see in some of these figures that these requirements are not being met. I have some additional soil samples photos to look at as well. And so there's an important process to highlight here. The laboratory processes the samples as received, and method 1633, section 11.3 states breaking the particle in less than 1 millimeter by pressing against the side of the container. And so this is not particle reduction. And so the project should really be aware that if the laboratory were to receive a sample that requires particle reduction, then this could be an additional preparation. And if not properly communicated to the laboratory ahead of time, you could have potential costs increase for your sampling and analysis, which could also increase the turnaround time. And so proper sampling techniques are required to not only meet the method requirements, but the project should communicate with the lab when proper sampling is not possible. So these are just a few examples where we've heard directly from our laboratories, and it seems small, but they have big consequences for our data quality. The good news is that many of these errors are preventable, and next I'm going to talk about how the project chemist can proactively discuss these during the planning phase to ensure it doesn't happen in the first place. And so it's critical that the project chemist not only understand the requirements of EPA method 1633, especially when it comes to those sampling techniques, but reviewing the field sampling procedures ahead of time, the project chemist can ensure that the samples are not only collected in a way that meets the requirements of the method, but is also representative of the site-specific conditions and our project objectives. And so, I mean, we do understand that when you're in the field, things happen and don't go as planned, and that's why it's important to outline the communication process for resolving questions or deviations in real time. And I'm sure everyone can write my next slide. Why does it matter? Taking the time up front to review those procedures and set expectations with the field team can go a long way towards preventing sampling errors and protecting the integrity of our data. And in doing so, we could increase our ability to meet our project-specific goals, we could decrease turnaround time, and we could potentially decrease our uncertainty. And I want everyone to know that there will be a pop quiz in my next phase of my training, so be prepared. And so now that we've covered the PFAS specific planning considerations, I'm going to shift focus again. The next topic isn't PFAS specific, but it's just an important just an important topic that project chemists should be very familiar with. We're going to look at the relatively new QSM 6.0 specific requirements that affects how data is being reported and why it matters for data usability transparency. So every project chemist should understand the requirements of the DoD DOE QSM 6.0 Module 2 Section 7.8. This section represents the minimum reporting requirements to reconstruct a level 4 data package. And so if the project determines that they don't need one of the required reporting elements, then a waiver must be approved by the project team. And I would recommend that that be documented on QAP worksheet number 34. To determine the minimum reporting requirements, it's recommended to collaborate with the data validation or the data validators and consider the type of project. For example, a long-term monitoring site with a focus on VLC analysis might have a lot of historical data, so the project wouldn't need to validate a stage 4, so you might not request a level 4 data package from the laboratory. Again, this is agency dependent. USACE typically recommends a level 4 data package for everything. On the other hand, if the investigation is for PFAS remedial investigation, we would expect a portion of that validation to be a stage 4, and in which case the laboratory shall meet the QSM minimum reporting requirements. And so to ensure that the laboratory can generate the data that will meet the project-specific requirements, the DoD EDQW strongly recommends the involvement of the project chemist and the laboratories during the planning activities. It's especially important because the project is a link between the data validator and the laboratory. And so this will actually lead me into my first poll question to wrap up this training session. So get ready to submit your answers into the chat. So the first question is, which of the following is a key requirement for reconstructing a level 4 laboratory data package? You can type in just A, B, C, or D. A waiver approved by the project team. B, the inclusion of all data outlined in the QSM. C, determining the minimum reporting requirements. Or D, no reporting requirements are needed. Okay, I love it. I'm glad people are paying attention to me. Oh, I see a hand raised. We cannot take people off mute. I'm very sorry. Okay. Yeah, it seems like everyone picked B, and I'm so excited because yes, inclusion of all data outlined in the QSM. Proper planning sets the basis for effective implementation. So setting clear expectations in our QAP worksheets and procedures will help avoid rework later. Understanding method requirements like EPA Method 1633, our site-specific needs, and policy is critical for aligning planning with the usability and data defensibility. Proactive communication with the laboratory, field teams, and our risk assessors can help reduce uncertainty, and document decisions in the QAP ensures data are transparent and traceable. So in phase 2, we'll focus on how effectively carrying out those plans and assesses performance against our documented expectations. So because we got kind of a late start, I'm just going to move into phase 2 immediately. One thing, I have posted a bunch of different resources that I've used throughout phase 1 and 2 that are at the end of both presentations, with a little note about why I commonly reference these links. Okay. Hopefully everyone is seeing phase 2. And again, this is the implementation phase. It will be presented by myself and Grace. Again, disclaimer is that other agencies might do a little bit differently. These are just my perspectives. Can everyone hear me okay? Adam, is everything good?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, great. Okay, in phase 2, our goal is to deepen our shared understanding of the project chemist role in data review. Specifically, the chemist role in reviewing the data validation report, the laboratory data package, and we'll walk through a practical 1633A scenario that'll illustrate common issues flagged during data validation, how chemists can collaborate with data validators early to resolve any discrepancies, and strategies for improving data defensibility. Like in phase 1, this discussion includes both the government chemist and the contractor chemist, but in this phase, I'll put heavier emphasis on the role of a government chemist. And I hope that this presentation will help our EDQW community as a whole understand what government chemists are looking for during a review. And with that shared perspective, hopefully we can strengthen data defensibility. And so with that context in mind, let's look at what data review is in practice. So before we dive into the data validation itself, I think it's essential to understand the depth and scope of detail required during the review process to ensure consistency, accuracy, and aligns with our project-specific expectations. So identifying the current stage of data validation helps determine the appropriate level of scrutiny and ensures that the data is reviewed in the correct context, whether it's preliminary, interim, or final. The specific reports and documentation to be included in the laboratory data package should correspond to the stage of validation being conducted. This ensures that all the necessary components are available for thorough evaluation and compliance with verification. And so with that understanding, I want with that understanding of what's involved in the data review, let's shift our focus to the actual stages of data validation. Oh, additionally, I'll say that ideally these were well documented in our QUAT worksheets 34, 35, or 36. Okay, everything I'm about to present is grounded in the DoD data validation guidelines. These outline the minimum requirements and expectations for all levels of data validation, regardless of who's performing the review. So these stages are meant to build on each other to ensure that data integrity and defensibility. So for the purpose of this presentation, I've included these little bubbles that will show how the preceding phase feeds into the next one. And so when I'm talking about a specific stage, the appropriate bubble will be shaded darker. And required for all stages of data validation include review of the summary or cover sheet, table of contents, laboratory case narrative, and the sample results summary form. And this form is defined in the QSM 6.0 Module 2, Clause 7.8. So let's first look at Stage 1. A Stage 1 review in the overall scheme of the data validation guidelines says to review the sample summary result form, the chain of custody, the sample receipt checklist, the holding time, and the field QC data. What is specific to Module 6 for the holding time is the project chemist should be familiar with the sample collection, preservation, storage, and holding time section of the method, as well as the EDQ memo recommendations for addressing hold times. As you can see, I have highlighted Stage 1 or darkened it so you know that which stage we're on. The Stage 2A in the overall scheme is to review the preparation-specific QC data and sample-specific parameter summary, which would include the method blank, our laboratory control sample, LCS duplicate, matrix spike duplicate, and matrix dupe, our sample dilution, or our sample reanalysis. Module 6, of course, has those QC data summaries, and within that module, we would also consider the ion abundance ratio, our extracted internal standard recovery, and our non-extracted internal standard recovery, retention time, our low-level laboratory control sample, our biosalts check, and our qualitative identification standard. Again, we see that I've darkened Stage 1 because Stage 1 is included when you do a Stage 2A review. Our next stage is a 2B review, and the overall scheme would be to review the instrument-specific QC data. So we should be thinking about the sequence and preparation logs, our instrument performance checks or our instrument sensitivity checks, our initial and continued calibration summary, and our internal standard summary. For Module 6, our PFAS-specific module, under the initial and continued calibration summary, we're thinking about EIS responses, analyte and EIS concentrations, response ratios or response factors, and our RR or RF relative standard deviation or the relative standard error. Next is the stage 3, and I've bolded this because this is where a lot of the work comes in. Before we were just doing a review, and in stage 3 we're still reviewing, but we also have to recalculate and requantify. And so the overall scheme is to look at the raw data, and we're looking at our sample results and our method and instrument QC, as well as our standard traceability. And specific to PFAS, under our method and instrument QC, we're thinking about our EIS and NIS recoveries, our retention time, our LCS, and our low-level laboratory control sample recovery, our matrix dupe, our instrument sensitivity checks, our calibration verifications, and our response ratios or response factors. And stage 4, again, bolded because this is where a lot of the work comes in, I think, again, and the overall scheme is to review any data manipulation, thinking about our target analyte identification, manual integrations, and signal to noise criteria. And specific for PFAS, when we're talking about that target analyte identification, we should be thinking about the qualitative peak identification section of the method itself. And so now that we've talked about the individual stages of data validation and what to expect at each point, I want to take a moment to explain how the rest of my presentation will be organized, and we'll be looking at our practical scenario that ties these stages together, and we'll highlight the project chemist role. So we're going to start to apply what we've covered to real-world situations. On the left-hand side, you'll see the general guidance or recommendations or reference. These provide the framework we're expected to work within. And on the right-hand side, I've outlined a specific scenario that would be carried out through the remainder of the presentation. And so my scenario is going to be PFAS analysis by method 1633A. This data is collected for definitive decision making. My laboratory is accredited to the DoD DOE QSM version 6.0. And I would like to point out that while I'm using 1633A in my scenario, the EDQW does not require a laboratory to be accredited to any particular version of EPA method 1633, and I've included the citation there for reference. I just decided to pick one to make things a little bit easier. And you'll see that I've put those earlier mentioned bubbles from my previous slide to just serve as a quick visual reference to remind you which stage of data validation I would be in. And so this side-by-side layout is meant to help us think through what should happen based off the guidance versus what happens in this scenario. And this comparison will set us up for our next steps. At this point in our scenario, our goal is to determine the appropriate level of review based on what's been documented in our CLAP. So first, is the laboratory data package complete enough to support the intended stage of data validation? Secondly, does the data validation report accurately reflect the appropriate stage of data validation? Thirdly, if either of these things are lacking, we must ask ourselves if our CLAP was well defined. Is there room for interpretation? And for the purpose of this presentation, let's assume that we're reviewing a stage 4 data validation report with a complete level 4 data package. And according to the QAP, 10% of the samples undergo a stage 4 data validation, while the remaining samples will undergo a stage 2B, which actually leads me into my first poll question. So get ready. So you can type into the chat, does the statement below provide enough information for you to understand the data validation process, or do you need more details? My QAP stated 10% of the samples undergo stage 4 data validation. So, oh, I'm seeing a lot of B's come in. Oh, I love that. Great. So I think everyone agrees with me, which I love. That so let's consider that my QAP actually said 10% of the samples per sample delivery group undergo a stage 4 data validation, and the remaining samples undergo a stage 2B data validation. In the chat, please let me know if you think that's enough information. If you think that this still isn't enough information, I would love it if you could put a suggestion into the chat, because then we can all be better at writing our QAP worksheet 34. Getting a lot of A's. Need to introduce matrix, for example. Oh, okay, that's interesting. I'll make sure that we're tracking that. Okay, great. Well, I appreciate everyone putting in 10% include field QC. Oh, good question. Okay, yeah, we'll be tracking this chat, and yeah, maybe we'll all get a little bit better about writing our QAP worksheet 34. So I'm going to move on to my next slide. So yeah, thanks for everyone to responding and highlighting some of the real world variability we face when it comes to our QAP clarity and documentation standards. And so for the purpose of this scenario, we'll move forward assuming that the data validation report is complete, aligns with our appropriate stage of data validation, and the laboratory package included all the necessary information to support the stage of data validation. And based on our poll question, we're confident that our QAP was sufficiently described to guide this determination. And so with that confirmation in place, we can now walk through our scenario. Before we move into the actual data review step, it's also important to confirm what's documented in the QAP is being followed, especially when it comes to our laboratory selection and accreditation. This ties back to what we covered in phase 1 and our DoD ELAP requirements. As previously stated, this data is being collected for definitive decision making, and the project chemist should verify the laboratory is in good standing. This is not just a one-time check. We know that accreditation statuses can change, so it's considered best practice to periodically confirm the laboratory is in good standing with the DoD ELAP. And so one way to check is you could go over to the EDQW and search for the laboratory accreditation status. And if it's in within good standing, that's great. But what if you cannot confirm the status on Denex? If not, there's a few other methods you could consider. One, you could check the laboratory data packages. Sometimes the status is included. Secondly, you could reach out to the laboratory directly. They should be able to provide you with the necessary information about their accreditation. And I've included a little asterisk because, of course, we have to make sure we're following the proper channels. You could always contact the EDQW on our help desk site or our contact us. And again, adding that asterisk because we have to follow the proper chain of command depending on our organization. And if despite these steps, the laboratory accreditation remains unconfirmed and the samples were collected for definitive decision making or definitive data, then the laboratory must be accredited in accordance with our DoD ELAP. And in this case, all associated results would be recommended for exclusion until proper accreditation could be confirmed. And so with that confirmation in place that our laboratory is in good standing, we can now begin the data review process itself. And it starts with a close and careful read of the data validation report. The data validation report is one of the best tools for a project chemist to identify where to focus their attention in the laboratory data package. And so as you read through the data validation report, you should be taking mental notes about any flagged issues or patterns and qualifiers or results that might require a deeper look. It's important to recognize that the data review is not a one size fits all, and it can and should vary depending on your agency requirements and the project risk level and the intended use of the data. With that being said, one of the best practices is to ensure a complete and thorough review of both the data validation report and our laboratory data package. You want to read the data validation report like it's a well-written technical book. It shouldn't be a murder mystery novel, and if it feels vague or unresolved, where you have to ask questions or take a deeper dive, then those are worth fixing. These reports should give you confidence in the conclusions being drawn and not leave you guessing. So we've looked through our data validation report, and in our scenario, we saw the note that the method blank had a detect for PFOS, and all associated samples with PFOS detects were J qualified. So we're going to keep that mental note in the back of our head, and now let's look at the laboratory data package itself and walk through what the project chemist should be looking for during their review. Okay, so with a clear sense of what was in the data validation report, we're looking at our laboratory data package and conducting our own review. And while the project chemist won't necessarily complete a report, you should document any discrepancies that need further elaboration. Even though the data validation report might appear correct, it's essential to verify. Never assume something's right without confirming it yourself. And so some of the verification tips that I have is to review the chain of custody. Check for those handwritten notes, checking sampling dates, receipt dates, along with the number of samples collected in the field. Review the sample receipt checklist, again checking for any handwritten notes or comments. Review the sample preparation log, verifying that the sample's preparation date and the number of samples, and ensuring that the holding times were not exceeded. Review the sample analysis date and confirming that the analysis holding time were not exceeded. I have become a little bit more familiar with databases or systems that might automatically calculate hold time, but sometimes eyes on the report itself is beneficial to check for some of those handwritten notes. If everything is in alignment, great, but if it doesn't, taking the time to thoroughly review each section of the laboratory report and data validation report just to ensure that the data is properly qualified. As you can see here, I've kind of highlighted two separate stages because I do kind of combine a stage 1 review with a stage 2B review in terms of looking at these reports. That's the only time that I jump around. And so in our specific scenario, we have 7 groundwater samples and 2 soil samples. They were collected on 310. The laboratory received the samples on 311. The samples were prepared on 4/5. This is 26 days from collection, and I've confirmed I have not exceeded any holding times as defined by my QAP. And they were analyzed 10 days after they were prepared. But there was a prep note. The field sample collection bottle was overfilled during collection. Removed portion to add spikes. And so with that prep note, I have another poll question. So get ready. Okay, what do you guys think about that sample processing described in the prep note? A, it makes sense. Removing sample to add spike is a valid step. B, it seems unusual. Removing sample could affect the results. C, I'm not sure what the impact would be, but it sounds a bit off. D, I didn't catch that detail. Could you please clarify? Okay, I see a lot of people responding with B. Oh, somebody put E. I don't know. You can tell me what E means. Okay. A. Okay. So I'm glad so many people are responding. But I'm going to move into a follow-up question. And so you can put this into the chat too. So our note said that the field sample collection bottle was overfilled during collection and a portion was removed to add spike. From phase 1, does anyone remember our 1633A requirement, which we should have documented on QAP worksheet 19 and 30? Oh, 3/4 full, not past the shoulder. Oh yeah, you guys are doing a really good job. I'm really thankful. Okay. Yeah, I think everyone seems to understand. Right, aqueous, do not fill the bottle past the shoulder, and solid, fill the jar no more than 3/4 full. And so if this did happen in our laboratory, like I said, mistakes happen, I would expect that the laboratory to immediately communicate with the project, and then the project could communicate with our field team. So, just to bring it all back home, it comes down to clear, solid communication pathways. These pathways aren't just between the project chemist and the data validator, they include the laboratory and the field sampling team. Key takeaways are that the sample must be properly collected to be truly representative of the site conditions, and if the samples do not meet the method requirement, it will increase uncertainty in the results. And so effective communication paired with rigorous sample collection practices can go a long way towards producing data that we can confidently use for decision making. So now let's get back to reviewing our laboratory data package. Oh, and I would have picked B or C. Either way, I would have been happy with either. Okay, so now it's time to review the laboratory case narrative. This section often contains a summary of anomalies, and it's a great place to start. Ideally, the case narrative should provide a more detailed justification rather than just copying and pasting information. The anomalies mentioned here should be compared to the data validation report. So Grace has made an incredible impact in the short amount of time, and she approaches every challenge with confidence and clarity combined with a strong analytical mindset with a impressive attention to detail. And so I'm going to let Grace present the scenario of the case narrative.
Thank you, Nancy. Hello, all. I am Grace Nepomuceno. If you missed the introductions at the beginning of the session, I am a chemist with the Air Force Civil Engineer Center. So today I want to walk you through a scenario in which the laboratory's case narrative and the data validation report's case narrative had some differences from one another and just how we handled that situation. The information presented herein is for educational purposes only, and it has been edited for clarity and content. So as Nancy alluded to, the data review process, for me at least, is just not a one-size-fits-all. So when I am reviewing laboratory reports and data validation reports, the case narrative is one of the first places that I will look. And from there, I will mentally annotate any deviations or anomalies. That way, I always have these key issues in the forefront of my mind when I am assessing the report. So this is a case narrative from the laboratory. So I will say there were a couple of other issues noted with this batch, but what I want to hone in on today is the failures associated with the low-level laboratory control sample or low-level LCS. So from what I understand from this case narrative is that the low-level LCS with batch 1 for sample XY failed high for the extracted internal standard EIS acceptance criteria, and the target analytes failed low outside of acceptance criteria. So a reduced volume, assuming for sample XY, was all that remained for a re-extraction. And because of that, the limits of quantitation and the detection limits were elevated. So my initial thoughts in looking at this case narrative, slightly vague, maybe, sure, but it's still understandable at first glance. Next slide, please. So I'm from the Midwest, so I would say once we get into the meat and potatoes of the report or the in-depth review, I discovered that sample XY does not exist anywhere else in the laboratory report. The sample in the report that did have elevated limits associated was sample 0XY. So which is right? You might be thinking, there is an absolutely clear answer to this question. Come on, Grace. But regardless of what that answer is, what should happen next? Next slide. So one possible avenue is to request a revision of the case narrative. Chemists who are reviewing projects need to be able to assess vague or erroneous case narratives. You should really be considering the nature of the project and plus the nature of your concerns. So if the issue is minor and it does not affect data usability, revisions may not be necessary, and instead explanation or additional clarification can be instead captured in the data validation report, which would mitigate revision of the laboratory case narrative. If the issue is major or it does affect data usability, then a revision of the case narrative should be requested. So in the situation presented herein with an incorrect sample ID, we present the following poll question. Next slide, Nancy. So should a revision or clarification be requested from the laboratory? And y'all can throw your answers in the chat. And in the interest of time, I will continue on. And yes, I'm seeing a lot of A's, and that is what happened. So I recommend in this situation and in other similar situations, I did and would request a revised copy of the case narrative to accurately reflect the sample in question. So my justification for it is because of the potential variability between the case narrative and the report, and just due to the complex nature of these analytical data verifications and validation procedures, it is important to minimize doubt and ambiguity. Simply put, as benign as this typo may seem, it does need to be corrected. Data is not collected without a purpose. It tells a story, and sample IDs can be present in multiple parts of just overall reports and contracts. And being able to map out those connections and map out that story to those locations is key to the overall big picture. Next slide, please. So the data validation guidelines, stage 1 validation requires that a case narrative is reviewed. This is a foundation for all data validations. All levels build off of this. So because of that, all levels of data validation require case narrative review. In addition, there is guidance in QSM 6.0, section 7.8, that contains criteria for the case narrative. Having the most accurate information will bolster the data defensibility, and when stored appropriately, this data may be reused or considered in future site decisions. So after the requested revision, the laboratory did correct the error in sample ID. However, in my opinion, the case narrative was still vague. And because this case narrative did contain other anomalies, it just spent more time for me cross-checking the results. At this point, though, let's think about the big picture. Do I need to go back to the laboratory and request additional clarification? Next slide, please. No. So here the decision was made to have the vagueness addressed in the data validation laboratory report. So presented here is the case narrative from the data validation report. And in my opinion, I do see a clear picture of the results and the outcome of the situation. Sample IDs were corrected. It was easy to cross-check the results. And regardless of this information being captured correctly in the laboratory report, it does need to be corrected in the original laboratory report with this erroneous information and the other issues that were taken care of in the data validation report. So the takeaway from this is, as trivial as it may seem, it is important to take time and effort into case narratives. These big projects can get very complex very quickly, and in the future, there may be non-chemist folks that may need to reference something in the reports. Down the line, regardless of where it is, incorrect information can cause chaos. Accurate information reinforces the defensibility of the data, which is really invaluable when it's being used to make these risk-based decisions, especially for those hot topic and high visibility projects. And with that, I will hand it back over to Nancy for our next topic and shifting into a stage 2A review.
Thanks, Grace. Hopefully everyone can hear me again. I don't see any thumbs up. Okay, great. Thanks, Adam. Okay. So with stage 1 complete, we'll look at our stage 2A data validation, which includes reviewing the summary reports. In general, reviewing the D-text, our percent recovery, our relative percent differences, dilutions or reanalysis, our ion abundance ratio, biosalts checks, and the qualitative identification standard. In our scenario, we noticed that a few target analytes had laboratory qualifiers on the ion abundance ratio sheet, a summary sheet. And I do put an asterisk on here because I want a project chemist to be aware that there might not be a specific summary sheet for the ion abundance ratio. It might be included only in the raw data. And so since the data validation guidelines are pretty straightforward, I'm only going to address the biosalts check and the qualitative identification standard in my next slides. There's just a few requirements that I think the project chemist should understand. The first issue that the EDQW has seen and wanted to bring to our project chemist's attention is the laboratories might not meet the requirement for biosalts check to elute at least 1 minute from the PFOS window, and it should include all its isomers. This is currently specified in the method, specifically at clause 10.2.2.5, and it is not optional. When this requirement is not met, it can directly impact the method's accuracy and precision. The second common issue that the EDQW has seen is the laboratory failing to include all the required biosalts when using the mobile phase other than acetonitrile, which is defined in clause 7.5 of the method. And so according to the method, when a lab opts for different mobile phase, they must supplement it with the full list of biosalts to maintain consistent extraction performance. And just omitting one or more of these salts could lead to incomplete analyte recovery, which can introduce significant bias and uncertainty into our results. The third issue is related to undocumented method modification. So while the method does have flexibility, any modifications made shall be technically justified and documented, which is stated in 9.1.2.2 of the method. And it may only be modified if the modification improves the quality of the data. However, we've seen cases where the labs may have made a modification without explaining why or demonstrating the improvement to the data quality. And for clarification, these particular biosalt requirements are not permitted to be modified because in doing so, they'll compromise the precision and accuracy of the method. So these biosalt requirements are a great example of how any deviation left unnoticed can cause data defensibility concerns. And in my next slide, I have a few recommendations that can help our project chemists. So one, I'll just say that there is some variability in the laboratory's approaches to the biosalts check. One, they could be named very different. So just know the naming convention, and they could use different methods. And so as a project chemist, it's important to understand which of the requirements may be modified and which are prohibited. And it's also essential to review the laboratory procedures for any technical justification and ensure that they align with our project-specific goals. Ideally, these are addressed during the planning phase, and it's just another reason to thoroughly review our procedures during the QAP development. And so now I'm going to move into the qualitative identification standard. And so this check is daily when standards become available. It would be documented on QAP worksheet 24, but just for situational awareness, at the time of this writing, the EDQW has not identified any required qualitative identification standards, but we are tracking their availability. So now that we've talked about the topics I wanted to cover in a stage 2A, we're going to move into a stage 2B. Okay. So this slide summarized general requirements for the Stage 2B summary report. I'm not going to actually go into detail here, but I did want to leave it up for reference for what a complete and compliant stage to the report should capture. And I also wanted to flag the new EDQW memo that is actually posted on Denex, and it provides important updates related to the sequence requirements. Again, this is a memo that the project chemists should be very familiar with to ensure that their laboratories are meeting the intended requirements of the method. And this method is important for our laboratories and accreditation bodies to be aware of as well. So with stage 2B reference here, let's move forward and take a closer look at our stage 3 data validation guidelines. As previously mentioned, stage 3, we aren't just reviewing summary reports, but recalculating and quantifying results. We're evaluating the initial calibration data is extremely critical, and our project chemists need to verify its accuracy. Recalculating the initial calibration isn't just about analyzing the chromatograms and understanding how the instrument behaves. So I want to take some time to talk about how the project chemist should evaluate the initial calibration in a little bit more detail. As a project chemist, one of our responsibilities is to independently verify that the calibration curve, the basis for all of our quantitation, is technically sound. This means that we should be able to recalculate the initial calibration curve ourselves and use that process to understand how sensitive and reliable the instrument was during analysis. It's also important that we understand where the EIS and NIS fits into these equations. The EIS in particular plays a critical role. It's not just a background check. The quantitation of the target analyte is directly linked to the EIS response, so understanding how it behaves is just as important as evaluating the analyte peak itself. Another key element is standard traceability. As project chemists, we need to understand how those standards are prepared, how traceability was documented, and how that can feed into calibration. Being able to trace those standards reports to recalculate and verify the curve is part of training data defensibility. And because we often see multiple data sets from the same laboratory, project chemists are actually in a unique position to identify patterns that may be subtle inconsistencies or systematic issues that others might miss. And so this pattern recognition can be essentially valuable for our project-specific needs. And some people might be thinking, like, this seems redundant with what is expected of a data validator. So I wanted to talk about those expectations. So let's talk about the data validator's role and how that compares to the project chemist. When it comes to reviewing data, like the initial calibration, a data validator might be tasked with reviewing just one target analyte, and typically they're focused on the that specific calibration curve for that specific analyte. And it's a necessary check, but it's also a narrow snapshot. There is a planning piece worth mentioning here too. Does our CLAP clearly define how many analytes are reviewed or how the data validator should choose that specific target analyte? If not, that could be considered a gap. And as a project chemist, do you know if the data validator always selects the same analyte? Is that particular analyte a high priority for the project? And what if you consistently have a non-detect for that particular target analyte? These questions are worth asking because our review decisions can impact how representative and defensible our data truly is. And so in my next slide, I'll talk about the benefits of the full chromatogram review. So for the project chemist perspective, the benefits of reviewing all the chromatograms, you see how often and why manual integration can occur. And noticing patterns could flag potential issues early and protect our field data evaluations and help defend the integrity of our reports. We always recommend reviewing data in the order it's presented. The instrument QC typically appears first because it sets the foundation. And so patterns you notice here, like consistent manual integrations or signal to noise challenges, is going to inform your evaluation of those field samples. So it's not enough to just see that the calibration has passed. You should compare those area responses to your actual field sample and pay close attention to any flag chromatographic issues, as these may mirror problems in our field sample results. This broader perspective can help us catch subtle but meaningful issues that might otherwise go unnoticed, especially if only a single analyte or a subset of analytes are reviewed by a data validator. And so reviewing the chromatograms will also give us the ability to compare the calibration standard directly to our field sample, which can help us assess how well the instrument is performing throughout the sequence and whether the calibration behavior matches what we see in our field sample. And of course, the actual comparison of the calibration standard to the field example is part of a stage 4 data validation review. So let's get into our stage 4. Our stage 4 data review, again, we should be looking at our target compound identification, thinking about peak integration, manual integration, our signal to noise, and our ion abundance ratio. And for this scenario, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to peak identification. So let's go back and think about our field samples and the calibration standards. So how a laboratory will integrate or flag QC samples is the gold standard for how they must treat our field samples. If a field sample show different behavior, like more aggressive peak picking, then our project chemist's spidey senses need to kick in. We should go back to the QC to verify, and if needed, request clarification or confirm with the procedure that the laboratory is following their process. This verification also includes the EIS since, again, quantitation is linked. So let's look at an example. Okay, in this example, we have a mid-level calibration on the left compared with the field sample of a similar concentration on the right. And so I've highlighted a sample in the I've highlighted peak in the field sample that's been integrated, but this peak is not represented in the calibration standard. To our project chemist, there should be a red flag going up. Because our calibration standard defines the detection and reporting criteria, if a peak appears in the field sample that isn't reflected in the standard, then we have to question whether the result is quantitatively defensible. It could undermine the reliability of the report of the sample results. So what is exactly going on here? The integrated peak at 8.5 minutes is an isomer, is specifically a branched isomer for PFOS. And what we're seeing is a matrix effect that the sample matrix is preferentially retaining the branched isomer, which is something the EDQW has actually observed frequently across many cases. And so the real issue being that the laboratory did not define an integration window that captured all required branch isomers as outlined in the method. And so this oversight can lead to inconsistency between the calibration and field sample results. And so this actually leads me into another poll question. So get ready. In the chat, let me know A or B or yes or no, however. Does it appear that the field sample is being treated the same as the calibration standard? B. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of B's. That's great. But I, of course, have to make it difficult and have a follow-up question. So I just want to say it's important to note that the concerns appear and proceed with caution. And so I always say, always seek clarification when an issue arises. In this case, I might request through the appropriate channels that the laboratory confirm whether the integration of the field sample aligns with their established procedures. If any discrepancies are found, I'll ask for any generated corrective action reports. So this is where I encourage our project chemists to have a strong working knowledge of the method requirements, and it'll allow you to reference those specific clauses when you suspect something isn't being followed correctly. In some cases, the issue may stem from difference in interpretation, and when that happens, it's appropriate to seek clarification, and that also might include reaching out to the EDQW for guidance. So now that we've compared our field sample to our calibration standard, I want to look at some more requirements of stage 4. Okay. So next in my scenario, I want to talk about the signal to noise criteria and the ion abundance ratio. If you guys haven't noticed, stage 4 is probably my favorite stage. Okay, so the signal to noise ratio are essential to distinguish true peaks from random noise. And so fundamentally, the signal represents the detected chromatographic peak while the noise represents random fluctuation in the baseline. And the ratio is measured of how well the peak stands out from the background noise. Typically, it's written as the signal to noise ratio is equal to the peak height over the noise height. I do want to point out that laboratory instrument software will automatically calculate the signal to noise, and they might use a different equation. It's often seen as peak area over noise area. But the laboratory procedure should include how the software is calculating the signal to noise. So now we can compare what a high signal to noise ratio provides versus a low signal to noise. A high signal to noise indicates a clearer and more accurate result, where peaks are well separated from the noise, making it easier to identify and quantify analytes. And the low might make peaks harder to discern, leading to potential errors in quantification and misinterpretation of the data. Per method 1633, peaks with low signal to noise must be flagged appropriately. Be cautious of labs manually integrating what looks like noise to force a detection. Also, compare the signal to noise values between the calibration standards and the field samples to spot any consistency. So now I'm going to look at 1633A specific requirements for signal to noise. Section 15, clause 15.1.1 states that for target analytes or EIS compounds to be identified, the peak responses of the quant and confirmation ion must be at least 3 times the background noise level. So that's where we get our ratio of 3 to 1. If there's no confirmation ion, the quant ion must have a signal to noise ratio of 10 to 1. And if the signal to noise ratio is not met, but the background is low, then analytes may be considered as non-detect. The signal to noise ratio is a quantitative calculation and should absolutely be included in our laboratory data packages. Project chemists can still gain a lot by visually inspecting the raw data. So even without calculating the ratio, you can get a good sense of whether the signal is clear and distinguishable from the baseline with a kind of visual check. And it's essentially helpful when assessing low-level detections or borderline peaks. And so on my next slide, I'll walk through how to interpret the chromatogram to assess signal to noise and what that visual review is and how it can be a powerful tool. So on this slide, we're looking at example chromatogram 1. On the left, we have the quantitation ion, and on the right, we have the confirmation ion. And I'll be using this example chromatogram 1 in several of my upcoming slides. Both of these are key. Both the quant and the confirmation ion are key to understanding how to evaluate our signal to noise. The simple visual method for gauging signal to noise is to consider the average height of the noise and then imagining stacking those noise heights 3 times. If the actual signal is about 3 times higher than the established baseline, it meets the signal to noise ratio of 3 to 1 required by the method when there's a confirmation ion. To help visualize the evaluation, I've added the boxes here to represent the signal to noise threshold for both the quantitation and confirmation ion. Peak integration isn't just about whether the peak is present, it's about how the peak is drawn, where the baseline is set, and whether the laboratory is following their documented methods consistently. So watch for unusual manual integrations and review the chromatograms thoroughly. So now that we've established a visual benchmark for the 3 to 1 ratio, the next step is to look at the threshold and evaluate the pattern of the peak. I'm asking, does my quant and confirmation ion line up? Is the peak shape consistent between them? Do these peaks match the behavior and retention times observed in my calibration standard? Again, while the actual calculation is provided by the laboratory, this visual check is just a great way for our project chemists to quickly assess whether the data appears defensible. And so from here, I'm actually going to shift into another method requirement that plays directly into this valuation, and then we'll start to pull all these pieces together for a more complete picture. So the ion abundance ratio criteria is outlined in section 15, clause 15.1.3 of the method. And it's either a project-specific decision or there is a default or plus or minus 50% of the ion abundance ratio observed in the midpoint initial calibration standard. Regardless of what is chosen, CLAP Worksheet 24 should include which criteria is being provided. Okay, so now we're going to revisit my example chromatogram 1, but this time we're focusing on different requirements of the ion abundance ratio. Earlier in stage 2A summary report, I noted that a few of my target analytes had a qualified ion abundance ratio, and here's why. The observed ion abundance ratio was 5.8, but in my sample, it dropped to 2.4, which equates to an overall ion abundance ratio of 41%. According to the method, the minimum allowable ratio is 50%, which was what was documented in my QAP, indicating a failure. And so on the next slide, we're going to look at what the method requires when you encounter this type of failure, and I'll pose a poll question to see how you would handle the scenario in practice. So the qualitative peak identification is identified in section 15, clause 15.1.4, and it says that samples shall meet the criteria of 15.1.1 through 15.1.4. If this criteria is not met, then field samples are expected to have qualification. If it is a QC or standard, the laboratory shall correct the issue. Okay, so get ready for my poll question. My example chromatogram 1 failed the ion abundance ratio, and the visual representation of the signal to noise has risen some concern. Should I expect my samples to be qualified? Say A or yes, or B and no. Okay, on this poll question, I really hope everyone includes their response. Getting a lot of feedback, that's great. I'm just gonna give it a little extra time on this one. So I think the majority of people are picking yes, but I'm going to insert my evil laugh because this was actually a trick question. I never actually told the audience if the example chromatogram 1 was a field sample or a QC sample. I see somebody said, I thought that. That's awesome. Okay, so now let's find out if I actually ever tell you guys if it's a field sample or a QC sample. Okay, but before, I want everyone to remember the note I mentally took during my review of the data validation report. And it said that a method blank had a detect for PFOS, and all associated samples with PFOS detections were J qualified. And so now that we're in stage 4, it's time to look at the raw data for the method blank. Okay, so it turns out my example chromatogram 1 is actually my method blank. And this method blank had a detect for PFOS, and as a result, all associated samples with PFOS were J qualified. So now I'm going to go back to my poll question, and in the chat, let me know if yes, my sample should be qualified, or no, my sample should not be qualified. Yeah, I would say no. My sample should not be qualified because this is a QC sample, and per method 1633A clause 15.1.4 states, if the criteria listed above are not met for standards, the laboratory must stop analysis and of the samples and correct the issue. So great. I did see somebody put B on the first time, so I guess you were slightly ahead of the game. Okay. So at this point in the presentation, I'm going to take a step back to look at the big picture of data quality and what it means for the project chemists and the role they play. Addressing these potential issues isn't actually always straightforward. So We've reviewed the method requirements for the chromatogram details and common issues, but sometimes despite it all, a judgment call has to be made, and that's where the project-specific considerations can come into play. You might be thinking, how often has this issue been observed? Was it isolated? Maybe it's part of a broader pattern. Is the analyte affected a target analyte of interest, or is it less critical? Were J qualifiers or other qualifiers already applied to this data? Did the deviation impact the key data points used in our risk assessment or our decision making? And what is the end use of the data? The goal of the project chemist is to qualify the data accurately and consistently. So then when we move into our data usability assessment, we know exactly what we can rely on and what we can't. And it brings me to my final concept about data integrity, not just about what to focus on, but why it matters. These decisions might also be agency dependent. And I've had to discuss these concepts with my fellow chemists on many projects. And so to wrap up the take-home message for data review, while reviewing data validation reports and laboratory data packages, it can be very complex, and the key is to follow a thorough, systematic process. Always trust the data validation report, but verify it by reviewing the data and following the data validation guidelines. Note any discrepancies or areas that need further investigation, and review everything. By maintaining a clear and structured approach, you can ensure that your data validation review is thorough, accurate, and reliable. And to close this training, I want to bring it back to the core message of both sessions. Proper planning sets the foundation for effective implementation. We've seen throughout today's session how technical issues can have a big impact on data usability, but many of those issues could have been mitigated early through better communication, clear documentation, and stronger planning. The few takeaways to take away are: communication is a critical part of the technical process. Don't treat it as an afterthought. Make sure to document your decisions clearly and consistently, and this will improve our data defensibility and reduces what you're in your workload. Clarity upfront reduces downstream workload. When expectations are defined early, reviewers and validators don't need to guess or revisit assumptions. Get the right people involved early and keep them informed as the project evolves. And ultimately, our goal should be to create a system where anyone can pick up any report at any time or any project, understand the decisions that were made, why they were made, and immediately get to work without losing momentum. And so thank you for your time and engagement, and I do hope you leave today with a better sense of how the project chemist role supports data quality and defensibility and the overall interactions. And like I said previously, I have included the resources that I use all the time, and they are including phase 1 and 2. And I have gotten approval to hopefully just post a PDF version of this to our Denix page, so you don't necessarily have to listen to the recording. So I'm actually a little bit over time, so I might wait to hold all my questions later. And yeah, I think I'll turn it over to Melinda now.
All right, everyone, welcome back. We'll start with session 2 of our EDQW training, Environmental Data Management in the DoD, Purpose, Principles, and Case Studies. That'll be led by Dr. Melinda McClellan. Dr. McClellan is a chemist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Environmental and Munitions Center of Expertise out of Huntsville, Alabama. She's a member of the EDQW and chair of the Data Review and Management Subgroup. Additionally, she's a technical manager for USACE's formerly used defense sites Chemical Data Management Program, or FUDSCAM. Then we'll have Brian Jordan. Mr. Brian Jordan is an environmental specialist and munitions response program manager with the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environmental Management and Restoration. His government career started as a chemist with USACE Albuquerque District over 30 years ago. His munitions experience includes stints as a chemist, project and program manager, and chief of the EMCX munitions section. They'll have Mr. Nathan DeLong. who is the acting IR program manager at NAVFAC headquarters. He also serves as a program manager for the optimization and NIRIS, which is the authoritative data source and repository for the Navy's environmental restoration data and documents. And finally, Mr. Mike Brown currently serves as a team lead for the West and Pacific Division U.S. Army Environmental Command, supervising cleanup actions in Arizona, California, Washington, and the Indo-Pacific. In addition to his cleanup duties, Mike functions as a senior environmental engineer, specializing in all aspects of water for the U.S. Army Environmental Command, Fort Sam Houston. Melinda.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to talk to you all today. So I'm going to steal the screen and hopefully share this one. So we're going to talk about data management. Quick show of hands. Who is excited to talk about data management? Like, give me a thumbs up or a clap or whatever. Okay, a whole bunch of you. That's awesome. It might be the most hands raised I've ever seen. That's amazing. So I'm going to start out talking to you guys today, and I'm going to talk a little bit of like basic underlying principles, and I'm going to get us all on the same page so that when we get into discussing like how is the DoD doing this and how is the DoD succeeding and where do we maybe need a little bit more work and what are some case studies that we all have sort of the fundamental same language to talk about it. Okay, but before we do any of that, I'm going to make you guys work a little bit. So we'll make all this stuff really tiny so that our screen here is really big. So I'm going to ask you guys for a minute to put into the chat, and I had hoped we'd be able to unmute, and we were going to be in person. It was going to be really fun. Everyone's going to be yelling at me. But instead, we're just going to yell through the chat, and I'm going to probably draft Denise if she wants to come off mute here to read some of the chat responses to me so that I can type while she reads to me. But
Absolutely.
you guys, tell me what you think makes a good data set. And I realize it's a really vague question, but just like, give me some words, give me some phrases. What makes a data set good?
You see it?
I see some of them, and
Clarity,
celebration
traceability,
neat.
concise. Oh my goodness, it's fast and furious. Reproducible. Metadata. Oh my. Good bookmarks. I love that one. Put that in there.
Metadata. Oh my gosh, you guys are seeing my like the extent to which I typo while trying to type fast. Validated meets QAP. Sample
Repeatable.
IDs. Consistent. Organized. Complete. Error-free. Clear understanding of intent. I'm starting to paraphrase. Normally I wouldn't paraphrase because in brainstorming you don't paraphrase, but I'm gonna have to here. Clear definitions. Needs DQOs. Give me like, I don't know, like 2 or 3 more. Sensitivity meets limits. DQOs. Okay. So now give me some ways or some things that make a data set challenging to work with, challenging to understand, things like that. I'm gonna grab this one because it's good. Okay. Large, incomplete, unfocused,
bad matrix,
vague. Crappy QC was in there. Missing data or unclear statements. Lack of qualifiers.
vague case narrative. Good one.
Yeah. Differing requirements over time.
Missing manual integration explanations. Interesting one. Mislabeling, good.
Unorganized.
Missing calibrations.
I'm just going to say missing information in general.
Like it.
In general.
Not bookmarked.
Okay.
I like it too.
So, give me a little bit more on like the provenance of the data, either what makes it good or bad. Like what's helpful or what might be challenging knowing like where did that data come from? Anybody have any ideas like you have to Allison saying Melinda define provenance. So like let's say I have a data set, right? And I need to know what is the like history of this data set? Who touched it? Who touched my data set? What makes that easier or more difficult? And you might have to let me know in the chat now that we're jumping between easier or more difficult. Yeah, knowing, well, I'm going to put that in the good, right? Knowing dates collected, complete chain of custody. Yeah, COC errors. All right. Has anyone typoed? That's probably not a word. Not identifying validators or laboratories. Typoing like Melinda does when she's typing too fast. Indeterminate. Reporting limits or methods. Formatting of data tables. Okay, so I'm gonna stop us there for the sake of time and to keep going. But hopefully, what you can see is that you know, we were able just in this rooms ourselves to brainstorm a lot of the things about like what do I want to see in my data and what do I not want to see. And a lot of this has to do because I suspect that a lot of us in this room are quite technical, right? A lot of this has to do with some of the scientific defensibility and some of the actual data quality of what we're looking at, right? Missing QC or QC that was poor, meeting our sensitivity requirements for our project, having that data be defensible from a scientific standpoint, right? Meeting our QAB, meeting our DQOs. But some of these are things that I would expect, even if I were, let's say, like planning a party, right? Like, let's say I'm going to plan my daughter's 10th birthday. Her 10th birthday is coming up, and I'm going to plan it. Well, hopefully I'm focused in the stuff that I'm doing, right? I'm not, when I'm ordering, you know, her party supplies, I'm not off here also, you know, ordering a bunch of groceries that we need for next week, right? And hopefully I'm getting not only the names of the kids she wants to invite, but like actually their parents' phone numbers or where to send that information to, right? And hopefully I would be able to make sure that, you know, okay, well, if I have this set of people, I'd be able to get this set of people again, right? And you can see that some of this just has to do with, you know, good management and good almost project management, right? Like this stuff is yes, it's data quality, but it also gets at that managing and making sure that we have clarity there. So what does the DoD say about some of this? So I pulled some quotes from this Secretary of Defense memorandum from 2003, which is about ensuring the quality of information disseminated to the public by the Department of Defense. And I'm going to minimize over here, so I'm not going to be able to see the chat anymore. So if one of my colleagues can keep an eye on the chat, that would be great. So sorry, trying to move things out of the way on my screen. It's almost like I need a third monitor. So we have this memo from 2013, and it's talking about these Office of Management and Budget guidelines, where they set forth a basic standard of quality for data. And they define quality as having 3 parts: objectivity, utility, and integrity. So if we think about objectivity, we think about that data being accurate, clear, complete, unbiased, and presented in the proper context. Okay, and we can all see where, well, that's super important, right? The data has to be accurate and complete. All the data has to be there, and it needs to be presented just as straight data, right? This is the data, and this is what it means. Utility, they say, they define as referring to the relevance and timeliness of the information, how it's related to its intended users, including, for the sake of this memo, the public, but any user of the data, right? Okay, well, that makes sense. I need to know sort of the purpose of this data and how it can and can't be used. Then we get to the integrity of the data. This refers to the security of the information, protecting that information from unauthorized access or revision, ensure that it's not been compromised through corruption or falsification. Now, all of this is talking just in general about data. It's not talking about chemistry data. It's talking about data in general. And we can see how all of these 3 things, well, yeah, that really gets to what I want to see out of data coming out of the government and the Department of Defense. So my question is, how do we ensure that our environmental data meets that basic standard of quality, meets those requirements for objectivity, utility, and integrity? Okay, so the first thing I do is I say, all right, well, what can I find in some guidance, right? And I go to some of my favorite guidance documents out of either the EDQW or the UFP-QAP manual or the EPA or the IDQTF, right? What do they say about it? Well, objectivity, right? That referred to it being, right, like correct, right, and complete. Well, how do we ensure that? So if we go look at the UFP-QAP manual, it says the project team identifies the type and quantity of data and how good the data must be to ensure that it's scientifically defensible environmental decisions are made. And then if we go even a step further, I guess back in like guidance, we can get to one of the EDQW stated goals is to promote the generation of environmental data of known and documented quality, right? Objectivity. Okay, cool. And I promise you guys, I could have pulled quotes for a week setting up this presentation about how do we get to objectivity in our environmental data, but I just pulled a couple of my favorites. So then utility, okay, remember this is like how that data is timely and relevant to its intended use. How do we do that? Well, relevant to intended use, my first thought goes to data usability assessment. And if any of my USACE folks are out there, you've heard me talk about this a million times and maybe even attended my 3-day long course on data usability assessments. But the first place I go when thinking about those is EPA QA G9, where right up there in the introduction, section 0.1, they say data quality assessment, and that's how they're referring to what we call a data usability assessment, is a scientific and statistical evaluation of data to determine whether that they are of the right type, quality, and quantity to support their intended use. It's a fundamental premise, or it's built on the fundamental premise, data quality as a concept is meaningful only when it relates to the intended use of the data. Okay, well, those are those exact words, right? Those key words, right? Data quality, intended use. And if we look at what the UFP-QAP manual says, it says data usability assessment considers whether data meet project quality objectives as they relate to the decision to be made. Are they suitable for that decision? It's the final step of data review. Okay, cool. All right, so that's how we get at that relevance, intended use, right? Okay, well, what about integrity? Integrity of data. Well, in my definition from before, it wasn't talking about scientific integrity, right? It was talking about like protection from unauthorized changes to it. It was talking about what I would call legal integrity, legal defensibility. Well, where do we talk about that? If we go look in the UFP-QAP manual, it says the QAP should describe how project data and information will be documented, tracked, and managed from generation to final use and storage in a manner that ensures data integrity, defensibility, and retrieval. So when do we do these things? I would argue, and you know, reasonable minds may differ, but I would argue that most of the objectivity, right, ensuring the objectivity of our data, that comes down to our systematic project planning. Are we getting the right type and quantity and quality of data? Utility, well, we get that through our data review, right? Knowing the quality of that data, knowing how it fits to our intended use, and especially that last step, that data usability assessment, which is that last step of data review. And integrity, okay, well, where is that? That's in our thorough data management, right? At the end of a DoD environmental project, I should be able to trace that data all the way through and know who created what, when, why, and how, right? Okay. So that gets us to data management. What is data management? So we can go look at this Department of Defense handbook to get a definition, which says that data management is a process. Data management identifies what constitutes data. Data management controls data requirements. Data management ensures data accuracy, and data management makes data available for use. So, from the standpoint of our environmental projects, if we don't plan for, collect, and base our decisions on legally defensible data of known quality, right? If we don't have that traceability back to how we made that decision, then when we go back and look at that data in the future, we might as well just toss a coin, right? Like if we can't trace where that data came from and know that that data was properly managed to understand both the quality and the intended use of that data, then we might as well just toss a coin. Okay, so that's why we're doing this data management, right? That's ultimately the goal. And I can sit here and I can talk about valid values and different types of databases and data standards all day. But if we don't keep in mind the purpose and why we're doing it, right, we sort of lose the motivation to do it in the first place. Okay, so before we talk more about specifics of data management, which I really do want to do, I find it helpful to have a little bit of terminology under our belt. Make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So data, what do I mean when I say data, right? Well, I'm talking about a value that represents some specific concept. So we might think of that as a number, a unit of measure, but it could also be the name of a contact, right? Their phone number, who signed this thing, right? A data standard, well, that's the format of our data. So maybe for, and I'm going to use this as an example because it's close to my heart, maybe for analytical data, we're talking SED, right? But there are other data standards, right? A JPEG is a data standard. This is something we use to make sure that everybody knows how this data is going to look and what it means in the format that it's in. And then metadata, what's metadata? Metadata, you always hear it's data about data, properties that identify the data. So like a card catalog is a good example of metadata from maybe before we used computers quite so much, right? The properties in a file, if you open up a Word document, right, you can go look at the metadata for the Word document to see, when it was last edited and who created it and all that, right? A version number of a document or of a SOP or something like that, that's a metadata. So these are some of the things we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about our data management and when we identify what we need to collect. Okay, so we know what it is, we know why we do it, we know what some of those pieces to data management are. What does it look like in practice? Well, it's kind of a cycle. Data is created, that data is processed in some way, that data is analyzed, used, decisions are made, right? Whatever kind of, maybe statistics you're going to do, if we're talking environmental data here, is done to that data. Then that data is preserved in some way. So this whole first part, this creating data, processing data, analyzing data, you're actively working with it, right? You're in there making changes, updating, applying qualifiers, right? If we're talking analytical data there. So you're actively working with that data. Then the data is preserved. And in this, we would say the data and the metadata, right, are preserved. Appropriate access is given at appropriate steps. So maybe the people who are going to see the final data aren't necessarily going to see that interim in progress data, right? Maybe they don't need to see that. Maybe they're not ready to see that, right? Or maybe you're like, Melinda, you are just a chemist. I am not going to give you access to, qualify or interpret any of my geology data. You get out of my geology. You can look at it. You can't do anything with it, right? Which it probably would be a smart decision. You don't want me messing with geology. And then finally, ideally, right, that data is reused in a way that's appropriate. And because we have all the information about it, we know where it is and isn't appropriate. We know how it fits with the future potential intended uses. Steps to data management. So you're sitting here thinking, yeah, I'll do all that when I have all my data at the end, right? Like I'll put it in a database, it'll be fine. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about active data management. So throughout all the steps of our project, where we're planning our project through our systematic planning process, right? We are generating data, right? We're having meetings, we're talking about our goals, we're making decisions about what SOPs we're going to use, what analyses we're going to do when those samples get to the lab, right? That's data. And the people who are there and the times where we made those decisions, those are metadata, right? While we're writing that UFP QEP, again, we're generating that data and we're all working together. Same thing when we're doing that field work, that laboratory analysis, that data reporting, we're generating that data and we should be making sure that we're doing it in the way that we said we would, by the people that we said we would, and getting it into the right, data standards and getting it into the right databases where we can work together. And then finally, of course, data review, right? That validation, that usability assessment, that final reporting. Again, we're in there, we're working with the data and we're making sure that we're maintaining that data integrity throughout. So what do we get when we do this? Okay, my animation went a little funky, but that's okay. When we actively manage our data, we're ensuring that we're getting consistent data content, consistent formatting of our data, right? Through our data standards, right? Through ensuring when we planned that we identified what we needed to collect. Those processing and storage guidelines, where's the data going to go? Who's going to be allowed to upload it? Who's going to be allowed to approve it? Who's going to be allowed to make changes? Who's going to be allowed to download it? For how long does it have to be stored? These things are all things we need to be thinking about when we actively manage our data. And for our DoD environmental programs, that really needs to start with the contracting phase, right? We shouldn't be thinking about this as an add-on later when the project's already underway. We should be thinking about, well, what are our requirements going to be? And what do we need to, within what framework do we need to work during our contracting? And then, of course, that having that data accessible, being able to see it in a way that is like collaborative and real time, so that if my chemist is seeing something a little funky in the data, right, like, oh, these results aren't what we expected, I can pull my geologist in and they can say, oh, well, it's because we had to move a well and we drilled into the wrong aquifer, or like, I don't know, again, you don't want me talking about geology, right? But you can get together with all the members of your team sort of right away as that data is coming in. Maybe you want to talk to your risk assessor about lead because the chemist thinks lead is really easy, right? It's just some metal, like it's not hard. And the risk assessor, says you need to stop talking. You don't know what you're saying, as anyone in the comments saw us talking about earlier, right? And when we do this, right, when we have this consistency, when we have this clarity in what we're collecting, then ultimately, at the end, we're going to have reduced errors, right? We're going to have reduced errors in our data entry. We're going to have faster interpretation of our data. We're going to have that improved or at least better understood data quality. And what does that get us? That gets us better decisions. That gets us cost savings. We're not out there recollecting samples because, we didn't get the data we thought we needed, right? Or, this data's from 15 years ago and we don't know what the sensitivity limits were on it, right? Somebody mentioned that earlier in our brainstorming, right? Or we don't know what method they used. And ultimately, that's going to give us cost savings. And I mean, as someone whose primary motivation is always data quality, sometimes I don't worry as much about cost savings, but as somebody who understands that, we live in the real world and we have limited resources and, we need to put those things to best use, where we can use something as sort of fundamental as managing our data appropriately to be able to stretch what we're able to do, man, that's awesome, right? That's what I want for the world. And then ultimately, all of that is going to give us better protection of human health and the environment. And ultimately, that's, I think, what we really are here to do, what I think all of us are here to do. The inverse, of course, when we don't actively manage our data, is we spend more money, right? We have to go out and recollect samples. We don't fully understand our decisions, or we're not able to make them with the same certainty that we want to, right? So that's all well and good. That's great, Melinda. Like, pie in the sky, you're awesome. We would love to do that. And then you're going to walk away and say, but I don't know how to apply this at all. So let's talk for a minute about some of those specific pieces of data, those specific data standards, that specific metadata that we're going to need to manage in our environmental projects. And I'll caveat this by saying, this is just me pulling in some resources that I have to try to sort of brainstorm what are these things. Some of them are going to be more well-defined than others. And this is where I'm asking you guys as a community to like help us develop this, right? So I definitely want to see some of those discussions happening in our chat. Like I said, I'm not the one watching it, but I'm hoping one of my colleagues will just like interrupt me and yell at me if there's something we need to talk about. So where do we start with our active data management? We start with our planning, and we start with developing that quality assurance project plan. Whether you're in our framework using the UFP-QAP as it's written, or some other kind of sampling and analysis plan, right? The principles still apply. So when we're doing that, right, we're understanding our conceptual site model, we're defining our problem, we're developing our DQOs, we're making that plan to conduct our project. What does that mean for our data, our data standards, and our metadata? Our data are things like, well, everything that goes into that UFP-QAP is data, right? Our DQOs, but also our measurement performance criteria. How close do our field duplicates have to be to one another? How low do our lab blanks need to be? What kind of recovery do I need to get out of my matrix spikes? Who's going to do the work? What SOPs are we going to do? What field methods? What analytical methods? What like revision numbers do we plan on? What data review procedures are we going to follow? Do we have guidelines? Are we going to make those guidelines requirements, or and then once I get all this data, what statistical analysis do I intend to perform on it? So those are all our data, and it's easy to sort of brainstorm different data standards. Well, that's a little bit harder. What format does this data need to go in? Well, I mean, one could argue that the UFP-QAP in and of itself is a data standard, right? This information goes into this worksheet. It's kind of a data standard. We play a little loosey-goosey with it sometimes, but it's a data standard. If we have a specific format for our meeting minutes, that's for my UFP-QAP writers out there, that like worksheet 9, right, where we document our meetings. Do we have a standard that says, well, don't forget to collect everyone's name and the date and the location, and at the end, don't forget to highlight all the decisions that were made? That's kind of a data standard. Our steps, our 7 steps to the DQO, that's a data standard, and I won't get into the DQO process too much, although I love it. But that is in a way a data standard. And then you could think about things like, well, how are we going to sign this, and what are the requirements on my electronic signatures? Can I like do that thing where you paste in a picture of your hand signature, or do I need to use my CAC to do the electronic signature, right? Those are data standards. Okay, well, what's metadata for this stage? Dates and attendance at planning meetings. Well, that kind of straddles the line, right? Because that's data and metadata. And as a side note, I got my dad's a data scientist, and I got into this like big discussion with him about the line between data and metadata, and it got like real esoteric. And so I just said, it'll be fine, Dad. So where is that line? That's an interesting question. But dates, drafts, revision numbers of those documents that came out of my planning, that's metadata. Dates of approval, the project manager signed off on this day, the government project manager signed off on this day, the distribution list. These are the kinds of metadata we think about during the planning process. Okay, now the part that I think probably most of us in this virtual room anyway would be a little more comfortable talking about. That's our field and lab work. What's our data? It's our data, right? It's our field sample IDs, our field sample locations, collection dates and times, all that chain of custody stuff. What happened in our field analysis, right? What were the results, units, what SOP did we follow? And then the lab, the whole laboratory report, that's data, and, go see the QSM if you want to see what all that entails. Our electronic deliverables from our laboratory. So what kind of EDD do we need from the lab? What format does it need to be in? What was the status of the laboratory accreditation for what analytes and what methods? So I think, all of us could probably sit here and brainstorm what constitutes the data for forever. What about data standards? Well, some are really easy to define, right? Laboratory EDDs, like that's obviously a data standard. So maybe you're using SED, maybe you're using some other EDD for some other purpose, but it's probably laid out. This column will say this, and this column will say this, and this column will say this, or in the case of an XML, you know, this node will say this, and it will reference this node, and those kinds of things. That's very obviously a data standard. A lot of times we have specified ways that we're going to collect that location data. Are we going to do this in a certain state plane? Are we going to, you know, survey it using GPS? How are we going to record this? Then we have other types of data standards. You know, if you're using a standard chain of custody form, that is in a way its own data standard, right? PDF is a data standard. It's, you know, pretty easy, but it is a data standard. Data formats may be defined in electronic collection devices. So if you're taking like a tablet out in the field to collect your data, there's probably a data standard associated with that, you know, so that when you have an export out of there, it's, you know, standardized what's where. And then there could be all sorts of others, right, that are defined by a program, defined by software that a contractor uses, defined by some other database like ERPMS or the FUDS or FUDS-KIM or the NIRIS database or anything like that, right? There's all sorts of data standards out there. What about the metadata? Again, this is the data about the data. Who generated it? When? Who reviewed it? When was it delivered? All of those things are not necessarily part of the data, right? They're part of the metadata. Where did that data come from? Okay, and then sort of the last stage, right, is this reviewing the data and reporting the data. And again, you know, that data are things like our data review reports. What did the validator say? What qualifiers did they apply? What did the data usability team say? What qualifiers did they apply? Who was on that team? When did they meet? What things did they discuss? Your project reports are, you know, data that are coming out of your final data review and the use of that data. And that's going to include things like the results of those calculations from that statistical analysis. Remember that you defined up in the first stage, right? And that was a piece of data. Here's what we think we're going to do. And here's, well, what we did do and how and what the results were. Your risk assessor's going to make some decision. You're going to update that conceptual site model. And then lessons learned are data, right? And we're taking those forward into the future. So we're going to make sure when we're managing our data that we're managing those lessons learned and how are they saved and who can see them and how are they, remember the data cycle, like reused going forward, right? Here again, data standards, if you have electronic data deliverables, there's probably a corresponding electronic deliverable for that validation data. There could be standardized formats for our data usability assessment reports, our data validation reports, our other project reports. Probably, I think most projects are putting their data out onto a map. There are mapping standards. There's stuff in GIS. I am not a GIS expert, but I know that there are data standards that they use to import or export data into GIS. So those are standards you're going to have to think about. And then certain programs have certain required elements on their maps, right? Those could be data standards. And then the metadata, again, you're talking about reviews, approvals. When was it generated? Who looked at it, right? How many revisions did it go through? What's the revision number on it, right? All that metadata. So these are the things that we want to think about up front while we're planning our project and the entire time through the life cycle, right? We want to stop and say, wait, this thing that I'm doing right now, is this generating data? How am I managing this data that is being generated? How am I saving it, right? Think about it throughout the life cycle of a project. But of course, we're not perfect yet, right? Or maybe we never will be because perfection is not something to be achieved. We're still facing, and by we, I mean DoD, but also our community here in this room at large, we're still facing challenges. So I've identified a few, right? Ones that I see, but there are others out there. So from a process standpoint, not all of our projects have defined data managers, right? I often see with our projects that are collecting a lot of chemistry data that they just kind of assume the chemist will do this. And maybe that's fine when it's just the chemistry data that you're looking at. But all that other data we talked about collecting, right? I like to think I'm pretty good at chemistry. And I've learned a lot about data management because I care and because I'm passionate about it, but I'm not a data manager by any means, right? And so we really need those people who have that specific training and expertise in how to manage data, right? And not all programs have even data management plans that address those specific needs of that environmental data. So in addition to having the data managers, having the data management plan would be a great idea. As far as what challenges do we face in terms of the data, at this point, I think it's really identifying all the important data. So let's think for a minute. And I've gone this whole time without saying PFAS, but I'm going to say it now. When we started collecting samples for PFAS, those very first projects going out there and doing that, did we know that we maybe wanted information on like the clothing that they were wearing? Were they wearing that waterproof clothing? Did they eat, they being the samplers, did the samplers, you know, have lunch with the fancy, well, I guess they're not all that fancy, but the waterproof fast food wrappers, right? Or what kind of sunscreen were they using? No, we didn't know that originally, and eventually we did, and we started collecting that data. But we're constantly learning, how do we identify what data we even need to collect and what data is important? Because no matter how we try, we'll never get every single possible piece of data. But identifying what's important and what do we need to manage, I think, you know, that's still something that can be a challenge. Data standards. Okay, you saw me talk a lot about like, well, this could be a data standard and this could be a data standard. And I think this is a data standard. But we, you know, clearly don't have data standards for all possible data types. We have some really good ones for certain types of data. But what about that chain of custody data? Is there a good universal data standard across the field? No, right? What about our field data? Maybe we're a little closer there, but is it universal across everything? No. Even our, you know, the laboratory electronic deliverables, they're not standardized everywhere. And where we do have some of those universal standards, they're not universally adopted across all programs. And not all data generators are going to have an extensive enough data management system themselves to produce the data to meet those standards. So for instance, there is a SED stage 4 that is defined, and I would be shocked if it includes all the raw data and everything. So if I suddenly started asking my laboratories for that, they would probably just laugh at me, right? And so that's probably not needed, but you know, depending on the size and complexity of the data generators, do they even have a data management system that can meet some of those more complex data standards? And then, of course, metadata, same as with data, what metadata is important and what's metadata and what's data? And like I said, I got myself all wrapped around the axle trying to figure that out when it got down to nitty gritty, splitting hairs. But just like data, what metadata are important? And how do I make sure that that metadata is preserved through different data transfers? So for instance, when DoD moved everything to the OneDrive, I was like, oh, sweet. I copied all my files over to OneDrive, and now the creation date is the date I copied them all over, right? Is it in the metadata somewhere when it was originally created? I mean, probably, right? But I don't know, and I didn't think about that when I transferred it. And so the same idea here, right? When we transfer our data between systems, are we maintaining and managing that metadata so that we preserve that historical, you know, chain of custody, if you will, of the data, right? Not just of the samples, but of the data. Okay, so what can we actually do about that? Right? I don't like to do these high level like, oh, let me present some issues and then not give you something you can do. So what can I do today? If I am managing a project, if I am planning a project, is it at all possible for me to bring in a trained data manager, right? Or can I take a person I already have and get them true data management training? Wherever possible, we need to start doing this because we are not moving to the future going to have less data, right? Our data is not going to get less complex. When I'm planning a project, when I'm starting, I need to be thinking about that data management from the ground up, from the very beginning. And what is my role in that data generation? I need to go look at my current data management practices, and I need to think, are these practices supporting data objectivity, data utility, and data integrity, right? What am I already doing? And as I do them, am I doing a good job of managing these three things? And then encourage others to evaluate their data management practices where maybe you don't have the, you're not in the right position to make those changes yourselves, maybe advocate for that going forward. So that's what you can do today, right? We could all log off of this right now and I could say, hey, go evaluate your work from the last day and think about your data management. Looking towards the future, I'm not gonna do that to you guys, but theoretically I could, right? Oh, you'd probably just ignore me. Going into the future, right? What can I do to help in the future? I can open up the discussions for a need for more standardized data management practices, right? When I start talking with my other partners, when I'm at conferences, when I'm in, these kind of settings and we go on break and we all go back into the back room and get our, iced tea, I can start talking about that data management practices. When I do my lessons learned from my current projects, right? I'm doing my data usability assessment. The last step there is what are my lessons learned and document them. Take a moment and say, hey guys, I'd like to talk about what we did for data management. Do we have any lessons learned there? And maybe you'll get crickets, and that's okay because you've planted the idea and next time we can go a little bit further with it. And then finally, advocate for and expect good data stewardship from yourself and from others. Data stewardship, what do I mean? Data stewardship is the careful, responsible management of data that's entrusted to one's care on behalf of others. So when I think about that for myself, right, I am here working on DoD environmental data. I have been entrusted with this by the public, right, for a purpose, right, to protect human health and the environment. So am I being careful and responsible in my management of that data to make sure that I'm protecting its integrity, its objectivity, and its security? So there's my contact information there. If you have any questions for me, we're going to move on and we're going to talk about some case studies. We're going to hear from a few people in the DoD environmental projects who are going to talk to us about how they're doing data management at their sites, right? And how that's helping them, what challenges they're still facing, what successes they have had.
Yeah, Melinda, thank
And
you.
thank you.
Yeah, so Brian Jordan here. I guess I'm next up. So, and please, Melinda, when you go look at the chat and you see all the things I talked about for right hand and left hand chemistry, just ignore those things, please. I feel bad now that I put them in there. But Melinda knows me very well, so she knows my sense of humor. So what I wanted to speak about, so from the OSD perspective, so I'm trying to bring that. She talked about environmental stewardship, and I'm one of those environmental stewards who has to then use this data, right? So I wanted to bring in that perspective of how does OSD look at this from the very top, from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So just a little bit of background about me. So you'll notice here, I'm a program manager for the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environmental Management and Restoration. And I'm program manager in munitions. So you're like, what does that have to do? You're not a chemist. I don't know. I was not on. I was actually in another meeting when Adam probably read my bio, but I am a chemist by training. I have over 25 years in with the Corps of Engineers, operating as a project and program chemist and in different arenas for chemistry. And I will just offer an anecdote for those that are old timers like me. I think it was second week on the job, I met Joe Solsky and we talked about DEAMS. So if you go all the way back to that, give me a thumbs up. I'm hoping there's only a few of you because otherwise you're probably looking to retire as well. But yeah, I go back that far as looking at management practices for data. Oscar put his hand up. I think he meant to give me a thumbs up, but that's okay. If he remembers DEAMS. The other thing, another little anecdote I will say is Melinda talked about needing an iced tea to talk about data standards. Now, if you approached me as if we were in a normal EMDQ setting and we were doing this live, usually we would have been having the social hour afterwards. We would need a stronger beverage if we're talking SED, which was Joe's baby as far as him developing SED with the EPA. So we definitely would need a stronger beverage as we talk SED and the deliverable of a staged electronic deliverable. And I thought it was very interesting to see some of the comments in the chat about how do I get something other than a PDF? And I was just screaming in my head, said. And of course, there were other people on the other end that were screaming, absolutely not. Do not give me a said. I don't know what to do with that. So I appreciate that topic too. So just quickly, our organizational portfolio, what do we care about? So my DASD, so the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, is Ron Tickle. He's responsible for guidance, policy, and oversight for compliance and environmental laws, prevention of pollution, management of natural and cultural resources, and cleanup of contaminated sites. So all of your DERP and O&M related cleanup is all under this office. Any of the compliance stuff. So, and I will talk a little bit about databases we're managing on the on-base drinking water. So our own drinking water systems that supply water to the dependents as well as service members on our installations. We manage a database for that as well. So we'll jump right into that because I want to make sure I give enough time for Mr. Brown and for Mr. DeLong. So what is one of the first data systems that we are a steward of? And this is that knowledge-based corporate reporting system. Many of you will go, I have no idea what this guy's talking about. So KBCRS, that's where all the programmatic execution information that DoD rolls up into one reporting tool that then gets published or sent over as part of what's called the annual report to Congress. So this is very important. And many of you, if you're chemists on board and you've been listening to a discussion on validation or data usability and data management, you're like, why do I care about this? Well, within the knowledge-based corporate reporting system, I'm going to point you to two fundamental pieces that are in there. The relative risk site evaluation and the military munitions response or military munitions site prioritization protocol. So those two things, usually you will hear them as an acronym, RRSE or MRSPP. And both of those are key components of both of those are chemistry data. So the relative risk site evaluation is directly tied to what was the maximum contaminant level found at a site and how do we prioritize it in relation to all the other sites within DoD and which site do we go to clean up first. And then something very similar in the munitions side. Now, most munitions sites are driven by the munitions hazard, so the explosive hazard associated with the munition that potentially is there. But on certain sites, we do end up with the chemical constituents of a munition becoming a primary driver for them, and that also is captured in that MRSPP. So I would just wanted to highlight that for you. And then we have in OSD, because Melinda didn't want to mention PFAS, almost I give her credit, like 25 minutes into her talk, she still hadn't mentioned PFAS. I'll mention it right off the bat. We have a PFAS off-base drinking water that we're monitoring and have data on. That's driven by an NDAA requirement, Section 345 of the FY22 NDAA. So that is, there's the metadata associated with that is it has to be data collected in a covered area off of an installation or site. And then we also have the on-base drinking water, which is monitoring of DoD drinking water systems to be compliant with the MCL. So when we'll go look at these this is where you can find that information. I'll show you how we get there or how I get there on a regular basis. So I'll share these slides and they'll be available to you all on DNext, but you don't have to memorize this nomenclature for this URL. I'll show you how you get to it easily, at least how I do. And then I'll mention another thing that is not chemistry, but one of these things that as a data manager, or if you're looking to be a data manager, you have to think about what the size of the data you're going to be storing. For us in the chemistry world, even though we may have very long data sets and we have a lot of data we collect over time, it is small compared to some of the other data management hurdles that DoD is facing. So in the MMRP world, we are doing advanced geophysics, classification, and that instrumentation, the raw file, and then also the process data. that could be multiple terabytes of data for a given project, or if the project is large, and some of these MMRP projects are over 1,000 acres, you're talking about some serious resources to store this data because of just the amount of data we collect whenever we do this collection of advanced geophysics data. So I wanted to highlight that a little bit for you all, that these are some of the programs that OSD is really focused on and trying to get, and how your efforts in data management feed into these systems. So I really appreciate your efforts when we start talking this. So I'll jump, and actually I want to show you just where you find some of this data. So like I said, don't memorize the URL, just go to Google and put PFAS OSD, and you will come, the first thing that comes up is the ASD per PFAS website. And then whenever we go to go to our data set, so it's DoD addresses PFAS, and we'll go to off base first. And I just want to highlight kind of what that data looks like for us here. So I'm not going to mess with the interactive map. I'm just going to go ahead in here and put, because I live in Arizona, I'll put Arizona in, and we'll go to Arizona. And because I know that this is a small data set and it'll generate quickly for me, I'm going to just go to Luke Air Force Base. We've not collected a ton of data off base at Luke, and I know that because I get to push all the data as it goes into this data system. And so here's our data for Luke Air Force Base. You'll notice we have that, one of those key things about a good data set is knowing when it was collected. So this is all data from 2022. You'll notice that everything is displayed here with the laboratory sample ID. And I do have the chat open. I would ask folks to help me understand why they don't see a field sample ID here. Anybody have any ideas that they'd want to throw into chat as to why I haven't included a field sample ID? What do we quite often put into a field sample ID? Yeah, PII. We put somebody's last name. We put, you know, a street address in there. Chemists love to build these. As a chemist, I can say this. Chemists love to build very complicated little nomenclatures for how, and systems for how we're going to name our samples. So yeah, all of our data that you'll see on this public site, though there is a field sample ID that is in the back end, anything we display is all based off of laboratory sample ID. So many of the laboratories go, what? Wait, why am I on the hook for this? Well, because you scrub out all the PII for us. So you'll notice here, because this is an older sample, it was collected under QSM B15 protocols. You have your units here, kind of key and important. If I'm going to list off a number, I better know to what unit it is. It's also important, so these 6 players here, why do I have these 6 players being displayed? Any ideas? Right, because they're part of the MCL, right? So these are this is what you will see as your primary constituents of the current MCL. Now, of course, the MCL is probably going to change here soon. But I know many of you are going, but Brian, you only show ND. What does that mean? And I'll hopefully get you over that hurdle. This is, again, for consumption by the general public. So ND, non-detect. We do say that down here, but I know us as chemists, we're like, at what level? I need to know, what was this reported to? What is my reporting limit or my non-detect limit that I'm going to have? And I'll get there and show you where we can find that. I also display down here quarterly schedule. So I have a sheet that is sent to me by the components that outlines when they're going to be sampling into the future, because that's also a requirement of the NDAA. So I'll return back to the map. So we looked at that. That was the general summary of what is displayed for the public. If you just go in, look for Arizona, look for Luke Air Force Base, because that's where I live close to, I can get that. I can also do what's called an advanced search. So we'll do something very similar. I'll pick Arizona, I'll pick Air Force, and I'll go ahead and pick Luke Air Force Base. Again, so very same data. I did not, in this advanced search, I can go and select which dates of a data set I want if I'm curious about that. But then I'll show that data. You'll see that we get the same 2 sample results again. Again, I'm picking a very small data set for a reason. And we get now, in this display, we're only seeing PFOA, PFAS, but the important part is that I have this, now I get this ability to download a final testing results spreadsheet. So I've already done this while Melinda was talking before. I went and did this. So I'm just gonna pull up that spreadsheet, slide it over into where it's visible for you all. And now you'll get to see, close this window, remove. But you'll get to see this is what the sheet looks like as it comes in from the data set. So the component ID, that's a specific ID that's captured in KBCRS. Well, what that component by name is. So this is Air Force data, the state, Arizona, Luke Air Force Base. Installation is active because I will have BRAC and National Guard and other things that are also in there. That laboratory reporting ID is there, or the laboratory report ID, as well as, in case anybody wanted to go back and actually look at the full data package from the laboratory, they could link that back or ask for it. We have that sample date, method, CAS number, what our analyte ID is, kind of important to understand which analytes we're looking at. And then we have this final result, and you'll see a bunch of nulls in here. That's because these are all qualified as U. So we have our qualifiers there. We have our J qualifier. So these are final qualifiers. So these are one of the requirements of the submittal of this data is that it's gone through a data assessment, and that we're only receiving final qualification on the data. So I quite often, when I first initiated this, I had a lot of folks go, why will you not let me push a B qualifier? I'm like, well, I understand that that is quite often associated with a blank and some issues with a blank contamination, but you need to tell me the final qualifier based off of all of your qualifiers. So, so this is how this data gets represented. And as we mentioned before, the non-detects. So if we pull off one of the non-detects like PFBS was non-detect at a reporting limit. Now this is older data. So many of you are like, holy cow, look at these high limits. Well, this is from 2022 using QSM using B15 as our methodology. So that's why that number, but if the public does, and again, maybe I didn't make this clear. So whenever I went to this page, you saw how I did it. I went to Google, I put in PFAS OSD, the public can get to this. I have no restrictions on who can get to this page. So this is the level of data they can get. The other thing that's really interesting about this data is, notice over here that we also capture and link up whether it was from a treatment system. And when we say treatment, quite often we're talking about a POET system. And then whether the sample was pre or post treatment. So in this case, we're looking at post treatment results, which seems a little odd that they'd be this elevated, but somebody needs to change out a filter or do something different than this post treatment. But this is kind of the data we're talking about when we talk about stewardship. I want to go back to here. So that was that data. And then I don't know if there's, we'll hold questions till later in case somebody has questions about this data here. But just quickly, we also have the on-base drinking water. And so it's loading that representation. And you can again go back, select this. I did not do a test run. I should have. Let me see if I have that same. So for Luke, I'm going to run into, let me see if I have data for Luke or whether it's going to say I have none. So here we go. So here's all the on-base drinking water. And here we have all the way back to 2019, basically when we first started in Ernst looking at PFAS data with our drinking water systems, and you can see all of the different pieces for the 24 entries we have for Luke all the way up until 24 data. And we can do that similar thing of downloading the detailed Excel report to get more definitive explanation of what a non-detect means. So that's really the key pieces I wanted to show. As far as Melinda talked about stewardship of the data, and I'm one of those stewards who then needs to publish this data for the public, and how, because there are a lot of you folks out there that are working to supply me data. I just saw somebody say, yeah, we email this data. How does OSD get this? Yeah, you're 100% right. I get it in multiple Excel spreadsheets that are sent to me each month, and that run through an upload process into my data system. And then ultimately I go in and I'm the final approver in that data system. And of course there are data standards, and it runs through a data checking routine within the upload so that I don't have to be kicking a lot of errors. I know that once it gets there, I have it. But yes, and we are always looking to improve this process, right? Are Excel spreadsheets and email the best way to do this? No. I will tell you, I had about 2 months from the NDAA to get this system set up and try to get the components to buy into, okay, what's the least amount of effort to get us the right data with that good stewardship so that I can publish to the public. So these are the systems we have. These are what my main concerns are at OSD, is trying to maintain these PFAS data websites. And then what is the next chemical, right? So we can't think that PFAS is going to be the last one. I think we all recognize that we had perchlorate before us. We've had TCE in our background for a while, 1,4-dioxanes in our background. PFAS is just the latest. So what is that next chemical is also something that OSD is focused on and where we're working forward. And with that, I will end with hopes of getting to Michael so that Mr. Brown can have some time to talk about Army's efforts.
Thank you, guys. My name is Nathan DeLong. I am the acting IR program manager at NAVFAC headquarters, as mentioned, and I also am the program manager for NIRIS, which stands for the Navy or Naval Installation Restoration Information Solution. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about NIRIS overall, kind of what it does, what tools it has, and then focus a little bit more on the specifics of analytical data and how we manage that. So this is a very high level overview of our system, but for anyone who's attending this that is a NIRIS user, as you know, we have a lot of webinars that we have given over the past several years that go into the nitty-gritty details of everything from the tools to other processes that we may use with this system. Okay, so quick NIRIS overview. Hopefully the slide changed. I'm on slide 2 now. NIRIS is the authoritative data source and repository for the Navy's Environmental Restoration Program. So essentially what that means is, you know, if we went out and paid for something, whether it be a document or a samples collection or land use control inspection, that NIRIS is the official record for that information. It validates that we got the deliverables that we paid for and provides that storage mechanism and repository for that information. The Navy,
Hey,
both,
Nate,
yes.
The slide does not appear to be changing. Do you want me, because you sent me your slides, do you want me to run it just to?
Oh, we can try that. Yeah, that might be smoother.
Yeah, just let me know when.
You also might want to try turning off your camera to help kind of your bandwidth.
Could do that as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Melinda, we're on slide 2 now. Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, got it.
So just let me know when to change slides and I'll go through it.
Okay, sounds great. As I mentioned, you know, the Navy, both the active side and BRAC, have been using NIRIS for quite some time. The policy for utilizing NIRIS as this data repository went into effect in the spring of 2008 for both agencies, and getting it off the ground. As you'll see, it's a big database with a lot of information, and getting it off the ground, there were some growing pains, to be sure, especially with getting in a bunch of historic data relevant to the program and making sure that there was data in there in a proper format to be able to utilize effectively. Those early days too suffered from, I think, from trying to balance speed of getting that data in with valid values and data quality, and we still run into those issues today of trying to rectify some of that. But I think overall, I've been involved with NIRIS in some capacity or another for over 10 years now, and I think we've made a lot of great strides in data quality and processes since then, and have learned a lot of things in the process. But overall, our goal with NIRIS is essentially to provide that access to environmental restoration program data, and use that platform to develop additional tools allowing us to better meet our legal requirements, policy objectives, and make data-driven decisions. I will also note that, whenever we can, we try to utilize data from NIRIS and other systems that our program uses, but a lot of it from NIRIS to automate a lot of these recurring data calls or data requirements that we have. I think two of the ones that have been more successful in increasing time spent on this and efficiencies include getting all of our documents that NIRIS stores automatically populating public admin record online pages has been a big one. And also, Brian was talking about the FY22 NDAA Section 345 for off-base PFAS reporting as a requirement. We've also managed to automate the collection of the Navy data for reporting those results to OSD. So we've automated that process within our own system. Like, we still email that data to OSD in a spreadsheet form, but that spreadsheet comes pretty much automatically populated whenever we get new off-base data, final off-base data submitted and loaded into the system. Okay, and next slide. Okay, so just a little bit of background about our users and our logins and how often NIRIS is used. As you can see, the growth of logins to NIRIS has increased almost year over year over the last 10 plus years. This is probably an effect of additional users, but also additional tools and other ways to involve additional folks and other systems that we might use as we pull some of that data in from other authoritative sources. At any given time, we have anywhere between 700 and 900 users, with about half of those being contractors, as they play a pretty pivotal role in submitting the data and documents that we pay for. Over last year, our monthly averages were about 524 users per month, with a little over 8,000 logins. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, NIRIS is made up of a bunch of tools aimed at different types of users. Our first set of tools are really for all users of NIRIS, and these are applications for discovering the data, searching or exporting environmental restoration program data from the system. So that has to do with the analytical query tool, which is where you'll find the analytical data. ER search for documents. There's a GIS component and a map viewer related to that, as well as document review tool and a tool that helps us manage our land use control requirements. Next slide. Next, we have a set of tools that are specific for remedial project managers and their specific teams that they utilize to help manage their contracts and task orders and those projects and deliverables. So these are basically utilized for managing and reporting on project deliverables and schedules and other information regarding environmental sites and site management plans, as well as business intelligence reports that, like I mentioned, not only pull data from NIRIS, but pull data from other environmental restoration systems that we use to utilize that authoritative data to help us give a better, more complete look at all of the data that is important to our program. Next slide. Then we have the data submitters, and these are the tools specific to them. A lot of the data submitters are going to be our contractors, the folks that we hire to go out and do that field sampling or write those reports in support of our program. So these are help manage the different deliverables and skills for those deliverables as part of a task order, submitting analytical data or submitting spatial data changes to the system, as well as requesting additional valid values that maybe need to be added to the system as things change. Next slide. All right, then we have our data manager tools, and these are tools for the individuals with elevated access, right? These are more of our data loaders. They're the ones who are Navy personnel or contracted support who have more of the database knowledge required to make sure that this data gets loaded or documents get loaded utilizing appropriate metadata standards, business rules, and helping to ensure that any CUI that is in any of that data or documents are protected appropriately. Next slide. And then finally, we have a suite of NIRIS help tools, and these are really for any user. Again, the NED selector, we'll get into that in a second, along with the NED tables. But there's a pretty robust help section within NIRIS that not only has all of our standard operating procedures or our environmental restoration record keeping manual, providing guidelines for our documents, but also includes like a wiki section where you can search for help on almost any topic related to NIRIS, and that's where one would find all of our more in-depth webinars and resources from those webinars that include videos and PowerPoint slide presentations as resources. Next slide. Okay, so this is a quick snapshot of some of the data that is currently in NIRIS as of the end of 2024. As I mentioned, it is a pretty big database containing a lot of records. We have, over 57.5 million rows of analytical results, almost 1,200 land use controls at this point, and over 350,000 environmental restoration records or documents in there. And as you can see from those graphs, it is constantly growing. So, good thing storage space is pretty cheap, because there's going to have a lot more information continually to come in over the years here. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for the remaining part of my presentation with respect to the Navy's data management, I am going to focus more on specifically the analytical data side of things. But what I would do is kind of talk about the life of an analytical data result in very high level terms, and how it relates to the NIRIS system, right? So, at the very beginning, the Navy has a requirement, and they put that requirement and outline it, describe it in a scope of work, and put it out for request for a proposal for a contractor to help support that. So, that scope of work will have list all the separate requirements as part of that task order or contract. And in one of these, in this particular scope of work, it's going to include a UFP CRAP or a sampling and analysis plan. So since that is part of that scope of work requirement, that's going to get added to our RPM tools portion of NIRIS as an expected deliverable for that task order. So once that is added as a deliverable, and you have a little screenshot here showing it, it automatically adds a bunch of dependencies, we call them, that are associated with that deliverable. So that could include a lab SOP, a draft version of that document, an internal draft version of that document, proposed field dates for when they're expected to be out in the field collecting that data. It also automatically creates a internal review process that jumps over to our document review tool that allows the NAVFAC QAOs to review that internal SAP to ensure that the guidelines for SAP creation are being followed, data quality objectives make sense, and things of that nature. So each SAP goes through that internal review with the NAVFAC QAO to ensure we're have that data quality there at the beginning of that process. So, just entering this as a expected deliverable to a task order, NIRIS already knows the SAP review details, anticipated field dates, and the expected delivery of that analytical data and that final document. Next slide. So after you have that established, we'll talk about the NEDS, which is a short for Navy Electronic Data Deliverable, and all that is, it's the NIRIS specific format or Navy specific format of how we want that analytical data to be formatted, to be submitted, and ultimately loaded into NIRIS. So, associated with that NED, there is a set of tools and standard operating procedures that help users along the way as they get through that process. Next slide. The first one is what we call the NED selector, and this is just a very basic tool that we encourage the contractor and the RPM to go before they actually start working on their SAP. This just helps them know which NED tables are going to be required based on the type of work that they're doing. So utilizing this really will limit surprises at the end, after they're done sampling, as far as what needs to be collected and what kind of format what kind of data needs to be collected in that process. And it's like I said, a very simple tool. You just go through a couple of questions, and I don't know if TurboTax still does this, but I was told that when this was developed, it was kind of modeled after that TurboTax theme, where it kind of tells you what kind of forms you will need as you go through the process of your submitting your taxes, or in this case, collecting analytical data and submitting that data to NIRIS. So it's a very useful tool. I don't think it gets used as much as it should, but we always point people to utilize that, just so there are, that they collect the data that they need, and there are no surprises at the end of a field event saying, oh, well, we need this to submit to NIRIS, but we didn't collect that data. So it is a good tool to go through beforehand, just to know exactly what needs to be submitted. Next slide. Okay, so this slide just shows our available NED tables. They're broken into different types of categories, and this is available in NIRIS to view. So this is a good thing to go in before you go out into the field as well, just to see what's there and see what kind of fields are part of each table. The screenshot on the left is actually an older screenshot that I forgot to update. The munitions survey NED tables, those have been changed a bit over the last couple of years, just to account for the additional prevalence of advanced geophysical classification types of munition surveys. So those have different titles there, but the basic idea of this slide has not changed. Those NED tables are there. You can download the specifications. Clicking on a table will pull up another page that will show you all of the fields related to that table, some of the rules and business rules associated with those fields, and whether or not it's required or not. And then, as you can see by the example of the proximity field being kind of highlighted there on the screen, clicking on any highlighted field will bring up a list of valid values for that particular field. So another good resource here to just kind of see what all is going on with the NED tables and the requirements for each of those tables. Next slide. Again, there's, prior to submitting the data or collecting the data, at any time, you can go in and download templates of the NED tables, which makes it a bit easier to make sure that the data is formatted and added into or submitted to NIRIS in the correct format. Next slide. Okay, so there is also a valid values or NED master list. This is another place you can go to check the valid values that are currently in NIRIS, and they're broken down into installation specific values and NIRIS/Navy-wide values. It's just another way to kind of look at what valid values NIRIS has and whether or not, if it doesn't have one, there's ways to go in and request a new valid value for any of those fields. Next slide. All right, so now you've actually collected the data, it's been validated, it's been final, and NIRIS does only validated data. We do not have unvalidated data in the tabular database, but you would go in and create a workspace to submit that data, or you can pause that and pick it up another time if you save it or transfer a workspace or reset. There's a bunch of different options when you go in there to submit that data. Next slide. Okay, and one of our big data quality checks here with respect to NIRIS and how we handle the tabular data is it goes through a tool called the NED checker. And this is basically a 4-step process that will go through the NED submission and check it for several different things, right? So, that stage 1 check looks at, data types, completeness of the entries, and checks it against the valid value list. Stage 2 looks at specific business rules and makes sure that data falls in line with those business rules. Stage 3, table relationships, including values from that master list. And stage 4, make sure that the data is not a duplicate of something that is already in NIRIS. So after each stage, you will get a table for each NED shown there below that will let you know if it passed or if it did not. And sometimes it will, depending on the depending on the severity of the error, it will make you go back and resubmit. Other times it will pull up a caution to kind of make you think about whether or not you want to do that. It's not necessarily a fatal error of the data, but it'll provide a warning, right, that you may want to look at that again before you go through to the next stage. But following, once that data passes through all of these different stages of the NED checker, the data manager for that data will give it one last look to make sure everything looks all right before loading it up into NIRIS. Next slide. And then anytime if you have submittals that you just submitted for that analytical data, you can go in and check on that status of those previous submittals. Typically, between submission and loading, it's typically about a week, I believe. Next slide. So once that data is in there, as I mentioned earlier, we do have an analytical query tool, which is a basic tool within NIRIS for users to go in and query on that analytical data. The query types here are listed on the screen, and they, for the most part, mirror a lot of the NED tables, depending on what you pick. You can't see it on the screenshot, but depending on what you pick on in that red box there, additional data fields to fill out and filter the data more will show up on the right-hand side of the screen. But this is just our basic tool that allows that analytical data to be pulled back out and then exported if necessary into other formats. Next slide. Okay, and then finally we have the documents, right? Like the documents, whether it's a site inspection or remedial investigation or long-term monitoring plan. The documents contain those analytical data results as well as other data that was submitted into NIRIS through the NED process, but also provides that context of that data, right? So as I mentioned, one of our more successful automation attempts was getting those documents that are submitted to NIRIS to records management and then loaded to NIRIS to be found using our internal NIRIS tools, based on that metadata to be pushed out to the public websites and the public admin record repositories to be able to meet that circular requirement of having those those documents, those administrative record documents available. So, once we get that final document deliverable submitted to records management, it goes through a review for review for CUI by records management and NIRIS. NIRIS actually runs a automated PII scan to pick up potential areas where there may be PII for someone to go back and do one final check. But then depending on the depending on the metadata related to that document, it is then sent to the administrative record to be available to the public. Next slide. And I think that's it.
Let me go to the next slide here. So yeah, I'm going to present a case study from the Army side on Army cleanup. And I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction because I think it'll help frame how I came about to employ a data management system for the Army. Do a little bit of background. I'll get into the case study just a little bit, talk about outcomes, and then I think we should have time for questions, hopefully. Yeah, so go one slide down. So yeah, I mean, the background, I started doing Army cleanup way back before there was even iPhones. And, I was working on an installation as part of the restoration program. And, we had at that time, we were getting electronic data. I would get electronic data directly from the lab, and it would create my Piper diagrams and everything for the reports I was generating, whether that was for LTM or some of the other reports. And I took a break from working cleanup and came back to it roughly after the pandemic. And magically, the Army didn't have a consolidated data management system for environmental data associated with Army cleanup. And that sort of took me aback a little bit. One of the things that I've, pride myself on is being able to manipulate data and present data in a way that, displays quantitative information well, and without having access to any of the relevant data from, the sites I was working, I felt completely uninformed and unable to make any decisions for the Army. So that was really, kind of eye-opening. And it set me on a path to rectify that situation, especially for the specific sites I was working. So my first challenge was where is my data at, right? Where is it? I mean, coming into it, it was retained by all of these different entities across the Army and in various formats, right? So we have some at, privatized water suppliers. We have some from contractors. Obviously, the Corps of Engineers holds some of the data based on whatever contract was awarded at the time, and USGS, doing Army cleanup work, employ USGS to do quite a bit of things for us. But there was no consolidation. I didn't have access to it. I didn't even have spreadsheets of the data for the sites that I was managing. So it was a fairly large issue. Where did I go from there? Well, I started looking at where's our admin record for our cleanup sites. And I was surprised that we didn't have a great system for managing cleanup documentation. And granted, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but there were, admin records in storage areas on the various installations I was working. Found some admin records in government vehicles. Some admin records were, in offices in various states of disrepair. And since, it was mid-pandemic, lots of people were gone. So couldn't really find access to any of the data or reports that I was looking for. So then I inherited a pretty big PFAS problem and started to project how much sampling we were really going to do managing an off-post and really on-post PFAS problem for the Army. And, back to what Brian was talking about, how are we going to manage this data? How are we going to communicate to residents? How are we going to do upward reporting for NDA requirements? All of those things. We had none of those tools, largely relying on, our contracted support to provide us the products to then email out to, whether it's to Brian's office or, to a resident. And the time from flash to bang on this was far too slow. And I did not want to rely on, emailing spreadsheets back and forth amongst the, project delivery team. That didn't seem acceptable or defensible over the long term. And so I just want to highlight, projecting out what we thought we were going to have in terms of sampling for this off-post effort, roughly 500 samples a quarter indefinitely. So, that's a fair bit of data, and without a system in place, it was going to be problematic for sure. So wanted to find something, and fortunately, I had worked previously with some folks out at Red Hill and was able to bring on the Synectics team to implement a pilot study for our garrison with this off-post PFAS problem. So I want to take you through a timeline really quick and just sort of walk you through what I've been able to work with not only our data managers, but the folks here at Army Environmental Command. So starting in about 2016, 2017, you all heard, the Army and the other service components implemented garrison or installation level PFAS testing. And from those, really, we learned, hey, we may have on-post PFAS issues, went out and did some PASIs, followed it up in some cases with remedial investigations. And that's really where I come in. And we implemented a pilot study for electronic data management in 2023. And that seemed to work very well for what we were doing in terms of managing our off-post PFAS issue. And then expanded it to 2 other installations in 2024. and then again expanded it again just about 6 months ago to include RAO LTM for the same installations. And then finally, and really this is just recent, we ingested all of the Defense Occupational Environmental Health Readiness System data. So that's that on installation PFAS information from drinking water wells on installation into our data management system. So what we have now is a full picture of all the PFAS sampling that has occurred on these installations that have both on post PFAS issues and off. But I will say this has been a large exercise, and it's a lot of work, and we definitely have needed to get buy-in across not only our project teams, but also folks here at Army Environmental Command. Like I said, we do not have a enterprise level system for Army cleanup. And that creates a lot of problems, with reporting and consolidating of data sets across the enterprise. We end up with very limited picture of what our operating environment is in terms of cleanup and, maybe cross-contamination of sites and or groundwater. So I just wanted to highlight that timeline and talk you all through sort of tactically, how long it has taken when we don't implement an enterprise level approach to data management at the service component level. Lots of work, lots of time, but we've gotten there, and it's been tremendously challenging. So, and I'm very conscious of time today. So what are the benefits? What are the things that I personally have seen over the last couple of years on, implementing data management and, for our, or my specific areas? First, we have real-time access to the data set, which creates, extremely quick reporting. When you do have an off-post PFAS issue, everybody wants to know the counts, whether that's how many wells, what's the concentration, the where, the when, the why, and all those numbers have to match, and you really do need to report it very, very quickly. So that has been one of the huge benefits that I have seen in terms of our pilot project. Second would be the transparency of the information and how long it's taking for sampling, data validation, input into the system, and then ultimately reporting back and finalization of the data, to include reporting time to the landowners who we have sampled their whether it's their well or their treatment system. We have time, and we can report how quick or how long it's taking us to do those things. Unfortunately, I'm still emailing the NDA report to Brian. Sorry. It would be great to have that be automated, but yeah, I'm not there yet either. But maybe that's something we can work on in the future. Another highlight is making QAPs that are consistent across the enterprise and across the project team, so we don't have to recreate the wheel. It saves a lot of time and really resources long term. Having an integrated team that has access to all the data at one place, very helpful. Coming into this, like I said, there were various data sets all over the place, and an unwillingness from some of our contractors to share that data with the other, whether it be contractors or other project members such as USGS. So breaking down those barriers there has been really helpful, and I think saved everybody a lot of effort and back and forth. Quick feedback for sure. Being able to check and understand where folks are at in the field and what we need and what we're not getting. And then finally, I think importantly, it's forward planning. Having our LTM contractors and the folks that are doing sampling and event planning for, treatment systems to load those plans ahead of time. That way we can project out, when folks are going to be in the field, what the expectation is. We can report back to our project chemists, hey, expect these data at this time. Again, it just, helps overall. And then finally, I want to talk about some large problems we've uncovered. And the first is reporting. And this I'm going to use an example from the regulatory community here. Going out and doing sampling out in the community is always hard. And then reporting back to the landowners, is critical. And we view it here within AEC and certainly the places where I work is responsiveness is extremely important, if not the most important thing we can do for those landowners. So we did a split sampling event with our regulatory partners, and unfortunately, our regulatory partners didn't document the sampling location in the correct way. That led to misreporting, and they issued a do not use order for a water system, and circled back to us. We leveraged our data management system and were able to determine that no, in fact, that sample was not correct, and the regulatory agency had to go back and then rescind that do not use order for that water system. We wouldn't have been able to do that as quickly as we could have had we not had access to all of the records, and not only that, but the analytical data. So that's one of the huge ones. And then secondly, just sampling itself. We have seen over the course of the last couple of years how important sampling is and how important it is to be very diligent with the technique as well as reporting, chain of custody and all of those things. And I want to highlight, definitely that regulatory agency issue of reporting all goes back to really sampling and proper documentation. So those are big ones that we've uncovered. I could go through lots of different iterations here, but I really do appreciate the time and to talk through sort of our pilot project here from Army Environmental Command. So thanks to the team, and I think I have one slide, and we have 2 minutes left, I think, on our webinar. So I'll stop sharing and turn it back over. Thanks.
Well, so like Melinda said, we've got some time for some questions. It looked like we've handled most of them. Melinda, do you see any in there that you want to address? If not, I can read a couple off.
She can tell me whether she's a right or a left-hand chemist.
That's right.
Can I be like ambidextrous? Is that allowed? I don't know. I didn't really get it, Brian.
Don't you remember? I think it has to do with chirality.
Like chirality?
Yeah, there you go.
Well, aren't most biomolecules right-handed, and it's like weird when they're left-handed?
Yeah, that's right.
So I don't know. Am I normal or am I weird? I'll let everyone decide that on their own.
All right. So what we've done is we've had contractor Zach has been collecting all the questions as we've gone along. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to compile those questions, send them off to all the presenters, and then we can get back to everyone who asked questions. That way we can think about them and come up with good responses. I really want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. I know we were all really looking forward to getting together in Pittsburgh and having the in-person workshop, but unfortunately this is the next best thing. So thank you to all the presenters. I think this is such an informative session, and I think we all really learned a lot. Please don't forget to register for the June 30th PFAS session. Janice will never forgive me. She'll be moderating the session. I think it'll be really informative as well. And that will be the conclusion to our 2025 EMDQ webinar series. So again, I want to thank you all for participating, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Marty, the presentations will be available at the conclusion of the webinar series. So we'll post all of the recordings to Denix, and I'm going to send out an email blast with all the information about that. Okay. Any other questions before we sign off? Okay, so that's a good question, Sierra. So if you register for the next webinar, make sure you select the one that has the date at the beginning. No, we cannot remove the initial link. I'm sorry, we've been trying. So just do the second link. It should say 6/30/25. That way you can be sure to get on the right webinar. All right, thank you guys. We look forward to seeing you on Monday. Alrighty, bye.
Bye all, thanks.